Thank you so much for coming. It's brilliant to see so many people here. My name's Georgina McGibbon. I'm the Programme Manager of the Camden Clean Air Initiative. We're a not-for-profit working to improve air quality around the borough of Camden and soon to be London-wide. The Future of Greentech is an event that we've been running for a few years now. It's designed to bring together a mix of thought leaders, pioneers, innovators, global companies as well, to explore the innovative technologies that are being developed and also show the importance of partnership and collaboration in tackling climate change. Before I go any further, I just want to say a massive thank you to Google, not only for hosting us and obviously giving us this incredible space, but just for their support running up to this event and all the organisation of it, Zoe and Hannah in particular. So thank you so much. And it's worth noting with Google that it's not just this event. They've been partnering with us since the beginning of Camden Clean Air. They provide funding for our projects, they send volunteers, help with community events and providing spaces of lots of other things that we do. So I think they've been instrumental in a lot of the success we've had, so we hope to keep working with them for the next few years. So massive thank you to Google. Right, we've got an incredible programme today, so I'm just going to run through what to expect so you know what's happening. These three topics were actually voted on a post-event survey last year, so anyone that's came last year and has come back, you should be pleased to see some of these. So first up is Renewable Energy, hosted by Dan McGrail. And in this topic, you're going to hear from Merijn Havinga from Novar. You're going to hear from Luke Clark from RenewableUK and Roisin Quinn from National Grid. We'll then have a short break. And then the second topic of the day is fashion, which is going to be hosted by Bel Jacobs. And in this topic, you're going to hear from two Earthshot Prize finalists. So we've got Colorifix, Sophie Vaud, and we've got Shannon from Circ as well. And then the final speaker in that topic is Goff from H&M. And then we'll have a lunch break. And the final topic of the day is sustainable investment, hosted by Gihan Hyde. And in this topic, you will hear from Sarah Teacher from the Impact Investing Institute, Sarah Kemmitt from the UN Net Zero Banking Alliance, and Andrew Howard from Schroders. So we've got a really great agenda. I'd also just like to share a quick and exciting update in terms of what we're going to be doing next year. So the Future of Greentech next year is going to take place in April as part of a brand new event called Earthfest. Earthfest is going to be a 4-day sustainability event created to inspire positive climate action, and it's going to be taking place at the King's Cross Estate, so right here, basically. There's going to be loads of different features, lots of different things happening across sustainability. There's going to be an expo with exhibitors from a variety of categories within sustainability. There's going to be a zone called Camden Electric, where we'll have e-mobility, test drives, demos. There's going to be a sustainable fashion programme in partnership with Central St Martin's, urban biodiversity workshops with London Wildlife Trust, live podcast talks at Samsung, loads of things happening. There'll be music, art, food. It's going to be an amazing 4 days. So the Future of Greentech will happen in April as part of Earthfest next year. So come and find out more if you're interested to get involved. There's going to be a QR code as well, I think, which I probably should have shared there. So you can download that, and that will be outside on the screen, so you can sign up to the newsletter to find out more. Right, I've just got some housekeeping. I've got a video to play from Google. So that should play, I think. And I'll move out the way.
And warm welcome to you from this Google event space. Now, please take note of the following important safety and security procedures. Remember to wear your visitor badge at all times. Always stay with your host. Be sure you know where exits are and avoid blocking aisles and exit routes. Please note that this is a smoke-free facility. In the unlikely event the fire alarm is activated, listen carefully to the announcement and follow instructions. Leave your belongings behind and immediately go to your nearest emergency exit. Do not use the elevators. In the event of a medical emergency, please notify local professional emergency services immediately. If you need additional assistance exiting the building, immediately make it known you need assistance. Call posted emergency numbers or contact professional emergency responders and communicate to them your exact location. Once outside the building, head towards the evacuation assembly area and stay near your event host at all times. When it's deemed safe to repopulate the building, an all clear will be given at the evacuation assembly area. Now, please silence your phones. Remember our important safety and security procedures and enjoy your time at Google.
Great. Lovely. All right. Well, that is everything apart from one more thing. So I've got the privilege of welcoming a really important guest speaker here to talk about the cutting edge work that Google is doing in the green tech and sustainability space, as well as the importance of collaborating with partners. I'm delighted to welcome Adam Elman, Head of Sustainability for EMEA at Google.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. How are you all doing? Thank you. It's pretty good for a Friday. It's a real privilege to be here and to welcome you all, and thank you to Georgina. At Google, we really are aligned with the spirit of this event, an event focusing on collaboration and technological innovation. It's really at the heart of what we do, and it's great to see so many familiar faces here also pushing forward on this agenda. And not least the Camden Clean Air Initiative, and as you heard from Georgina, we're really proud to have supported them right from the start, and it's been amazing to see the impact that they've been able to have right here in this neighbourhood. At Google, our commitment to sustainability really started when the company was founded. We've just celebrated our 25-year anniversary, and as I say, it's really key to everything we do across our business. But sustainability needs to start at home, so a focus on our own business, our own operation, has always been key to us. And we've set big, ambitious goals. So we have a goal to be net zero across our operations and our value chain, so Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 by 2030. And actually within that, we've got a goal focused specifically around clean energy. So we've been sourcing 100% renewable energy since 2017. And whilst we're really proud of that, we want to go even further, and we want to source clean energy locally every hour of every single day. We call that 24/7 carbon-free energy. It's a hugely ambitious goal. We're around 2/3 of the way there, so we're making good progress, but a long way still to go. And although, as I say, we focus within our own operations, actually we think we've got an exciting opportunity to support others as well. And we think technology is key to this transition. And there's a lot of research that backs this up. There's some research we actually commissioned last year that showed that 20 to 25% of Europe's net zero goal, so 2050 net zero, will require some form of digital decarbonisation. And we're looking at seeing how we can use our technology to help others, whether that's partners, governments, cities, companies, NGOs, as well as individuals. And I'm going to spend a few minutes today just sharing some of the work we're doing in this space. And I'm going to focus on two areas today, mainly transportation and energy, as between them they cover 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, let's start with transportation and Google Maps. So Google Maps has been helping people get around more sustainably for many, many years. We've given you information on how you can walk to places, information on what public transport routes might be available, and in recent years adding information such as bike and scooter hiring. But last year we introduced into Europe what we call fuel-efficient routing. So fuel-efficient routing is aimed at drivers. It uses artificial intelligence to take in many different data sources such as traffic, topology, weather, to surface up the most fuel-efficient route if it's not already the quickest route. So helping you save both fuel as well as carbon emissions. And since we've launched this, it's helped avoid 2.4 million metric tons worth of CO2 emissions. That's the equivalent of taking 500,000 fuel-based cars off the road every single year. And we're always looking at seeing how we can enhance Google Maps. Just recently, we announced some work we've done with TfL, adding thousands of kilometres of cycle lane information to help cyclists get around more efficiently and more safely. We're also helping in the aviation industry. Now, flying may not be the most sustainable form of transport, but sometimes it's the only way to get to where you need to get to. And we've particularly focused our work around contrails. Now, contrails are those thin white lines you often see at the back of aeroplanes. And this may surprise you, it certainly surprised me. They account for around 35% of the global warming impact of the aviation industry. So after fuel, contrails are the next biggest impact. And we've been using AI to figure out when contrails are being created and therefore come up with suggestions to avoid them. We've partnered with Breakthrough Energy on this, and earlier this year we tested it with American Airlines on 70 flights, and using AI technology recommendations through to pilots, we're able to reduce contrails by 54%. And we're really excited that last week we announced a new partnership with Eurocontrol. Eurocontrol control much of the airspace over Europe. So we're bringing this technology to Europe, and we'll be able to make these recommendations to pilots in European airspace, and look forward to sharing the results in the coming months on that. In the energy space, it's not just our sort of digital products, it's our physical products as well. And Google Nest has been using machine learning. So it's a Nest thermostat, has been using machine learning in people's home to learn patterns and automatically adjust heating and cooling. And since launching in 2011, this has helped save over 113 billion kilowatt hours of energy. Just to put that in perspective, that was twice Portugal's energy use last year. We're also using AI technology to help accelerate the introduction of more clean energy and renewable energy into the grid. And one of the products we launched this year is called Solar API. So Solar API, again, uses AI and many different data sets to help solar developers and installers and designers speed up the process for residential solar installations. So it has all sorts of data sets, so it can look at individual properties, look at the size of the roof, the pitch of the roof, it can look at shading, it can look at the light, it can bring all the information that a solar installer needs so they can do the design without actually having to visit the property. So it's much quicker and actually much more accurate. And we've actually deployed this to a number of test pilots, and it's been hugely successful. We've now opened this up to the industry, and again, we're really excited about the opportunity here to help accelerate the deployment of solar energy. Now, I mentioned before the work we're doing at Google on the energy that we use and how we're deploying new clean energy onto the grid. But it's equally important that we make use of the clean energy that's already on the grid. And won't surprise you, we use AI to do this. So within our operations, we have a carbon intelligent load shifting solution. What it does is it looks at what are the compute jobs that we are going to need to run on a day-ahead basis. It also looks at what clean energy is going to be produced on an hourly basis on grids around the world, and automatically adjusts the computing loads to where the cleanest grids are. So we can really make best use of the clean energy that already exists on the grid. And so if any of you are using Google Cloud, you're already benefiting from this technology. I seem to have lost a slide in here, but that's okay. I was just going to mention briefly, I've mentioned a lot around the work we're doing on climate mitigation, so the work we can do to reduce and avoid climate and carbon emissions. But actually, we're already feeling the impacts of climate today. And we're, again, trying to figure out how we can use technology to deal with that. And one of the ways we're doing that is with regards to floods and flood forecasting. So floods affect around 250 million people every year, often with devastating consequences and with huge financial loss as well. And we've been able to develop a flood forecasting model for riverine floods, and we're now able to predict floods 7 days in advance, so giving that really early warning for people to take action. And we've now deployed this to 82 countries around the world. In fact, last week we announced an expansion to the US and Canada, but it's already available here in Europe on a solution called Flood Hub. So you can look that up, you can find it on Google. But we also make this information available to government, and we send out alerts on Android devices. And we, as I say, we're now able to deploy that 7 days in advance, and we're continuing to expand that around the world. And we're using similar technology for things like wildfires and hurricanes. So whilst we want to obviously deal with climate mitigation, it's really important we deal with the impacts we're facing today. So that's a bit of an insight into the work we're doing at Google. So much of what we do is working in partnership with others, which is why we're so excited to host this today. As I say, that spirit of collaboration, technology and innovation. So thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Do I make it? Right, good morning, everybody. Thank you to Adam for that superb presentation and actually just some of the really interesting insights into how technology is being used. I mean, I think the transition of energy and net zero is so much a technology story, but there are such an incredible amount of applications and things and roles that people can play in that space. And the first of our panels and discussions today is about renewable energy and the role that renewable energy will play. My name is Dan McGrail. I run an organisation called RenewableUK. For those of you who don't know RenewableUK, we're the trade body that represents renewable energy technology developers and technology companies who play a role in either developing and building renewable energy assets that help reduce carbon emissions on our electricity system, but also the companies that provide the services, the engineering, the innovation to make it all happen. And it's a real privilege to do that. We're not for profit, and we essentially have the job of also trying to influence and shape the laws of the country, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, to try and make this happen as quickly as possible. We have about 500 members, and so I think and I hope that I can speak on behalf of a sector which is pretty united, and we also cover the grid technologies and all of the important enablers to make it happen. So we're going to hear from 3 speakers this morning, but I want to just start by giving a bit of context to the discussion, and maybe start by looking backwards. I got involved in renewable energy about 15 years ago, and at the beginning of the last decade, we were talking about something called a trilemma. And this trilemma was this notion that you had a trade-off between the cost of renewable energy, which at the time was incredibly expensive, the security of the supply, in other words, the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time, and the sustainability of what you're doing. And that would be essentially how you would balance that system, and how you would balance those trade-offs would be the way that you would find a way towards a more cleaner and sustainable future. And a lot of the government policy and the way that the markets were designed was put in place to manage that set of trade-offs. And we come to today, the really interesting thing is that renewable energy is at the apex of each of those 3 points on the trilemma. It's the lowest cost form of electricity, and there is little doubt about that. It's the most sustainable because it's zero carbon, but it's also the most secure. And I think in the last year or so, we've demonstrated how important that security is of having the vulnerability and the exposure that we have to fossil fuels resulting from the war that we saw kick off this time, a year and a half ago. And that volatility and that exposure to fossil fuels is something that governments around the world have sought to accelerate, to transition away from that exposure so that we build renewable energy systems all over the world. And analysts, there's a general consensus that renewable energy systems are by far the lowest cost systems, the most secure systems, and the most sustainable systems going forward. So the question is now, how do we move to the next phase? Reflecting on our own organisation, RenewableUK started in about 1978, believe it or not, and it started very much as an academic pursuit. It was set up by a series of professors, some of the early entrepreneurs, and I kind of characterise it by thinking about their job was about campaigning. It was about making the case for cleaner energy. It was to build awareness about climate change and climate science. And then maybe over the last decade or so, it's been about proving the concept. Can we actually deliver this technology and build it and do it in a way that brings society with us and create trust so that governments will invest in it in the long run? And as I've said, we've in many ways proved that case. And now it's about an industrial era. It's about a massive transformation that we're about to undertake, or we're in the middle of undertaking, within society. And that will affect people. And I think we'll hear from the speakers today about some of the consequences of that and how we manage it, and some of the big challenges that we'll face along the way. And that brings me a little bit to the politics. You can't really talk about net zero and clean energy without acknowledging some of the politics we've heard over the last few weeks. But one of the things that we find, and we do a lot of polling as an organisation, and we find that communities, people across the country are incredibly supportive of the energy transition. Climate tends to poll as the 3rd or the 4th most important issue for voters. And people are incredibly supportive of renewable energy assets in their communities, much more so than people would think from the onset. But there are some challenges, notably around building more and more grid. And it's one of those, we'll hear from Ro on this a little bit later, but it's fairly obvious when you think about it. Most of our primary energy today comes from oil and gas, and we're going to turn a lot of that into electricity. That means we need much more electrical infrastructure to deliver it, and that is a political challenge that we'll come across over the coming years. But the role, and I think for us, when we talk about renewables and our job in promoting renewables, one of the things that we really want to bring across to people is actually our role in the economy and economic growth. It's not anymore just about climate. Not that that isn't the central reason why we're doing this, but it's also such an important opportunity for society. And for a country like Britain, with great innovation, great engineers, great digital technology, this is a great lever of job creation and innovation for the future. And we need to grasp that opportunity and make the most of it. And the role of technology, therefore, is changing. Much of the role of technology or technologists and innovators in this sector began about how do we bring the cost down? Because as I say, a decade ago or more, it was incredibly expensive. And we've been incredibly focused on that journey over the last decade or so, and we've delivered an awful lot of success. But now the role changes ever so slightly. It's now more about scale. How do we do this at much larger scales than we've done before? How do we make the technology sustainably? How do we source the critical minerals and the materials that are needed so that the machines themselves are as sustainable as the energy that they produce? How do we make them more reliable? And how do we deal with variability? And topics such as storage of electricity and energy in general will become increasingly prevalent in the debate. So we've got three excellent speakers to come before us. We're going to hear from, first of all, from Merijn and Havinga, who joins us from Novar, who are a solar developer, and we're going to hear the story about solar energy, but also some of the technologies that sit around solar energy, and I think that'll be really interesting as we talk about hybrid technology. We're going to hear from Luke Clark, my colleague from RenewableUK, who's the Director of Industrial Development, whose job is really to help make the industry happen, and no small challenge there. You'll hear a little bit about the technology journey that the wind energy sector has been on. And then we'll hear from Quinn. And Quinn is the head of asset operations at National Grid. Arguably one of the biggest challenges in the sector and one of the biggest jobs is how do you build the grid infrastructure that makes all this happen. When we've heard from each of them, we'll go into a panel discussion. We'll maybe ask some questions about technology, about the human challenges, about the growth opportunities. And you'll also get the opportunity to ask questions. So please do think of those questions as you go through. We'll have mics roving around during the session, and please do keep them concise so we can get as many people in as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Merijn, and let's hear the story of solar energy.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me today. So today I would like to talk a little bit about the future of renewable energy. But first of all, I would like to tell a little bit about myself. So my name is Merijn, it's a very difficult Dutch name. I'm from the Netherlands. I've been working in the renewable space for about 9 years in various countries in Europe and Africa. Currently I'm responsible for the international expansion of the Dutch renewable energy developer called Novar. So personally, I think it's really important that we will have a collective understanding of a new energy narrative. So what that means is that we're changing to a fundamentally different energy system, which is moving from general located or centrally located generation towards localized generation, but also changes the way in which we use energy. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, But first, maybe setting the stage a little bit to talk about the UK, seen from our perspective. So I think in the UK, if we look at the developments, the UK has been pioneering wind on and offshore, and has seen a very fast decarbonization of the electricity supply over the last couple of years. Also, solar energy has really been picking up in the last few years. But still, there's quite a few challenges that have to be tackled. As mentioned already, grid congestion is a huge issue. We'll talk about that more later. But specifically for connecting renewable energy assets, the queues for connecting them are very long nowadays. Also, to balance supply and demand from the renewables capacity requires a huge amount of storage. Lastly, if we look at investor confidence, I think the uncertain political support as well as the subsidy schemes can really impact sort of the confidence for both national and international investors to build projects in the UK. If we look at the Netherlands, we have actually been very slow in adopting renewable energy. But over the last couple of years, we have seen solar energy specifically picking up, which has led to the Netherlands now being globally the highest, having the highest solar capacity per capita. So this has mainly been driven by the subsidy scheme, which has generated trust from investors to build capacity in solar energy. But we're also facing challenges. As you probably know, the Netherlands is a very small country, so there's high pressure on land use, meaning that we have to manage the conflict between agriculture, renewable energy, housing, and this is a big discussion in our country currently. At the same time, we're also facing grid congestion, which makes it much more difficult nowadays to get a connection to the grid for renewable energy assets. So now I would like to talk about Novar, but first show you a short video.
It's time for energy. Green, clean, with a major impact. Energy with zero emissions. Energy that challenges us to realize sustainable ambitions. It's time for new energy. We are Novar, and we'll fix your energy transition from A to zero. With energy from natural sources, electricity and heat storage, sustainable supply, and smart management, Novar realizes major turnkey energy projects for companies, governments, and cooperatives. And with every asset we deliver, we build your green energy system. We do it with experience, new technology, and a healthy dose of determination. Together with new energy. Novar. Getting new energy done.
So Novar, our goal is to realize 4 gigawatts of sustainable energy by 2030 through green energy systems. So we're doing this by building a variety of assets. So we're building the large solar farms, the solar rooftops, but we're also looking at battery storage, at hydrogen, even at solar heating. And all those different technologies are actually part of what we call the green energy system. So the green energy system is combining clean generation and storage, but also smart supply and management. And what does this mean, or how do we do this? I will give you a few examples. So first of all, we're trying to use land efficiently. So an example is this solar carport, which we built next to a festival terrain. So Lowlands is one of the largest Dutch music festivals. So every year people will park their cars next to the festival, and now they're actually parking their car under this solar carport, which provides shade to the cars, but at the same time it's being used to generate electricity without affecting the land below. So during the year, the sheep will be grazing under the solar carport while generating electricity equivalent to about 100 festival weekends or almost 18,000 households. Another solution is combining sun and wind. As already mentioned, there's a complementary load profile for sun and wind assets. So I'll explain that a bit more. We've built this solar farm, which is called Doorhout Mees, in the province of Flevoland, and it's located next to a wind farm. So often when the wind is blowing, the sun is not shining, and when the sun is not shining, the wind is blowing. So in order to manage the grid congestion, we can actually combine those two, the solar farm and the wind farm on one connection, and we can ease some of the pressure that we have on the electricity grid. Another example is greening industry, which is a major topic to decarbonize or to reach net zero. So an example is a project that we built. In Dutch it's called Vloeiveld in Hollandia, and it's next to a potato factory. So the potato factory has what they call flow fields, and they're using that to transport excess water from the potato processing in these flow fields. So on top of these flow fields, we've built a solar farm, which is producing electricity for the factory, but also feeding into the electricity grid. At the same time, we are building an electrolyzer, which is producing hydrogen. This hydrogen is then being used by a nearby located logistics company, which is using the hydrogen to fuel their trucks. So this is an example of how we can combine all those different technologies within one green energy system. So what's next? First of all, we have to look at how we can add value by integrating renewables in the landscape. The first way to do this is to look at the impact on biodiversity and ecological value. So actually solar farms can have a positive impact on biodiversity. Solar Energy UK has done some research which has shown that if you build a solar farm, this will positively affect the surrounding. Because the solar farm will stay there for about 30 or 40 years, and it can actually have a positive net effect compared to arable land. Second of all, we can have a double use of land. So you can do this by combining agriculture with solar generation, or as I have shown already, building a solar carport, which can be combined with, for example, sheep grazing. Another topic is smart solutions to tackle grid challenges. So while at the same time we're improving the grid, we also have to continue to build additional capacity. So we have to look at smart solutions. So one of them being, for example, combining sun and wind on the same grid connection, but also looking at what we call smart grids. So in that way we can have a localized supply and demand of electricity. So for example, if you have solar panels on your roof, you can use electricity at the same time that the sun is shining. But you can also look at this in a wider scale. So if we build assets in the same place where we use electricity, that can reduce the pressure on the grid. Similarly, localizing supply and demand of renewables for industry is a really important topic. Decarbonizing industry is a complex issue which really requires a case-by-case approach, and also requires to look not only electricity, but also renewable heating. So some of the technologies that we're looking at as well are e-boilers or solar thermal, to, next to electricity, generate renewable heating for industry as well. This is what I want to share with you today. Thank you so much for your attention.
And the next speaker is Luke Clark from RenewableUK.
Hello, morning everyone. I'm Luke Clark, that's me with a giant Lego wind turbine, which is currently standing in our office, and it spins as well. So I'm going to start with a photo of an inspiring forward-looking image, and I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One is that is who we are as RenewableUK and as an industry in the UK. You know, there's a lot of gloom around, there's a lot of climate anxiety, but we really believe that we have these solutions to the climate crisis. And that's what we're delivering, and I'm going to talk to you today about the centrality of wind energy in particular as a solution to the climate crisis. The second reason that I like to start with an image like this is that there are no more like that. The rest of it is all pretty much energy geeky stuff. So on which topic, this is exactly what I was talking about. So here, just wanted to take you through where we are. There's a lot of talk about the UK's progress or lack thereof on meeting net zero. How do we get there? So let's start with where we are on renewable energy. Here you can see the capacity building over the last 10 years, well, more than 10 years since 2010. And it looks pretty good. You know, there's a very large increase across all the technologies that we're dealing with. And it's also worth noting that we started from a low base. As Dan said, we as an organization started in the late 70s, and the first turbines weren't installed until the 1980s and early 1990s. So the eagle-eyed among you might also notice that around 2017, 2016-ish, progress on onshore wind and solar somewhat stalled. Now that is the result of policies that the Cameron government instituted to limit the development of those technologies. We're starting to see that grow again, but while this is a technology story, it's also about political will, public support, and we have seen that that kind of stop-start policy has a real impact. I should also just say that the first 5,000 megawatts, the first 5 gigawatts of wind that we built in the UK took about 19 years. Now we're building 5 gigawatts every 2 years, and very soon we'll be doing that on an annual basis. So we're starting from a good position, providing about 40% of electricity. But when we look at where we need to get to, it gets a little bit more of a challenging picture. So that's where we need to be in terms of renewable capacity to get a zero carbon electricity grid in 2035. And then when you add in what we need to get to net zero, it's even more daunting, you might say. So how do we get there? There are a number of technologies, renewable technologies. Here we have different options for onshore wind, for solar. 3 different scenarios shows you the kind of growth that we need to see. With onshore wind, we need to see at least a doubling in all scenarios. In solar, the rate of growth is even higher. Now, obviously, the reason that there are these scenarios is that we have a choice of technologies. Depending on what government does with nuclear power, we've got a new nuclear power plant being built in Hinkley at the moment in Somerset. And also, it depends on what we do in terms of planning. That's the biggest barrier that we face in onshore wind, and it's a similar story in solar. But regardless of which scenario we end up in, I'm going to focus in on one of our technologies, offshore wind, where actually, no matter what choices we make, to get to net zero, we're going to need a huge amount of offshore wind. You can see there's very little variation in all those scenarios. So can we be confident that we're going to be able to develop all that offshore wind? And unsurprisingly, our answer is yes. And one of the reasons is technology development. I haven't gone all the way back to those Tichy turbines that we were putting in the early 1980s. But if you look here, you can see the scale of technology development in 30 years. But even actually, if you just go back the last 10 years, it's 10 plus years, it's quite remarkable. And with the largest turbines, the 15 to 18 megawatt ones that are starting to be installed in the UK and in different global markets, one revolution of one of those turbines will power a house for 2 days. So the scale and the innovation that we've seen has been incredible over the last 10 years, and that's accompanied a huge amount of cost reduction. So government has been running in the UK auctions on it's now annual basis, but every 2 to 3 years they've been running auctions, and we've seen the price of offshore wind reduced by over 60% over that period. So when you take the kind of speed of deployment, the scale of the technology innovation, and the price reduction, it really is much more what you'd expect to see in a sort of consumer electronic project rather than a major infrastructure project. So what we're doing here is really quite unprecedented, and it is delivering major value for consumers. So here we have the current level of the energy price cap, that's how much electricity costs. You can see the orange dots, the price ranges that we've been able to secure for offshore wind is hugely in consumer interests. And that's not only on a sort of short-term basis, because obviously we're impacted by the crisis in Ukraine, but even looking ahead, so what power from a gas station, a new gas station, would cost in a couple of years' time, a massive saving for consumers, and from going massive saving to consumers from offshore wind. Dan sort of touched on it. We might pick this up in the challenges. I think we are at an inflection point, though. We've had a very benign environment for the last 10 years, and the industry has been relentlessly focused on cutting costs. But we have seen the impacts of the Ukraine, commodity prices, and price shocks have actually started to really bite. And so we're probably at a turning point where we need to look more at sustainability of price as part of a value proposition to consumers. So here is what we have at the moment in the UK, operational offshore wind farms. First ones were built off the north coast of Wales and then the Irish Sea Basin. And then we started to see larger projects on the east coast. In the next 10 to 15 years, out to 2035, these are the offshore wind farms that are planned. And you can see there is, expansion of our existing sort of base in the Irish Sea and along the east coast, and a little bit of new development off the southwest. But the really striking difference is in Scotland, and particularly off the north coast of Scotland. There's a huge amount of projects that are going to be coming through. And that changed geography also points to actually a big technology challenge and opportunity. The wind farms that we've been developing to date have been, if you look at this map of water depths, have been in the yellow, orange, red zones. That's the shallowest waters. As we move up into the green and the blues, in Scotland, it's much deeper water. The wind resource is fantastic there, but it means that we have to find new solutions. So to date, we've been building mostly the first two types of turbines that you see there with fixed foundations on the seabed. But what we're going to need to do is get to new floating technology where the turbine sits on a floating foundation that's then attached to the seabed. Now, this is a big technological change. There's a lot of innovation happening. We did a floating offshore wind conference in Aberdeen a couple of weeks ago. And depending on who you talk to there's either 80 or 120 designs for floating turbine foundations. So we're very much in the foothills of deploying this technology at scale, but that offers us a huge opportunity. And it's not just in the UK, it's also a global opportunity. Apologies, that graph on the right isn't displaying correctly, but basically by 2035, floating offshore wind will have gone from less than 1% of the global market to about a third of the global market. So it's a huge scaling up. And this gives you an idea of the markets aside from the UK that are pursuing it. And there's a huge focus in China, the US, West Coast, and parts of South America as well. But the challenge that we have is maturing and scaling up, as Dan touched on in his opening remarks. With floating offshore wind, you can see one of the turbine foundation structures there. At the moment, they can take months to produce each one. And if we multiply that by the 1,000+ foundations that we need in the UK alone, that's not going to work. So the challenge that we have is getting the investment into the UK that will help us to build the factories, scale up the technology, and mass produce and serialize production, as we've managed to do with traditional fixed offshore wind. We're doing that in a really challenging context because for obvious reasons, the global race to secure clean energy investment is more intense than ever, led by the US, what the Biden administration are doing. So we have a big challenge in the UK to keep up and be part of that race. That's some of the work that we're doing to develop a more planned industrial strategy for the offshore sector. But I think for me, maybe I kind of told a lie at the start. For me, this is an inspiring, forward-looking image. It represents where we are going and also the opportunity that we have to build a UK clean tech powerhouse in the offshore wind sector and deliver the climate solutions we need. So thank you.
Thank you, Luke. And finally, I'd like to introduce Quinn, who we work incredibly closely with. Very grateful for how closely we work with National Grid. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great when you stand on a stage and see a picture of yourself and realise that you don't have Lego, and that would be an immediate improvement. But I'm delighted to be here. My name is Roisin Quinn. I'm Director of Asset Operations for National Grid Electricity Transmission. I was going to try and explain what my job is, and then I thought it might be easier just to make sure we all know what National Grid is and what we do. Because when we think about energy and sustainability, we have to remember there are some deeply technical, weedy, nerdy problems that have to be worked through, all of which I love, but I recognise that maybe not everyone else does. So National Grid, we're a group of companies. We're in the UK and the US. Key bits to note, we are the electricity transmission owner in England and Wales. That means the spine of the power system, the backbone, everything kind of has to flow through that. We also own a distribution company. Distribution companies, think of them as your last mile logistics. Bulk power comes to them and they get it into your home, into your business. Within our National Grid Ventures business, we have interconnectors, the massive big super inspirational cables that go from continental Europe to the UK. And then in the US, we have some generation interests as well. But in terms of National Grid electricity transmission, that's about 4,500 miles of overhead line. There's about 300 substations, the places where you kind of bring power in and then get it out to the right spots. There's a huge amount of it that you can't see. It's about 900 miles of underground cable. And crucially, we provide really unparalleled reliability across the power system in the UK. When I say we, that is the network operator that I work for. It is also the distribution companies, the transmission companies in Scotland, and the generation fleet and the suppliers. It is a real team effort partnership. And I highlight that reliability because it's so important that people remember that's what they have. And that's what you should expect as we go through this energy transition. People can take it for granted, and that is great, and that should be something that you can continue to take for granted. So my job as Director of Asset Operations is to worry about all this stuff and to make sure that if there's a fault, the team jump on it and respond very quickly. It makes me a weather obsessive. I am tracking storms at the moment with a lot of gusto. We think about maintenance. We think about the individual assets and when they might break and what might happen to them and what the consequences of that might be. We decide when we're going to maintain something so that it doesn't break. We make sure that people are safe from the power system. Electricity in its uncontrolled form is lightning. You don't send children out to play with lightning. And so making sure people are safe all the way through this is a crucial part of my job. So building on what we've heard already, we've made huge progress towards net zero in the UK. Emissions have fallen. We have had more zero carbon power than ever before. It's outstripping fossil fuels. We've had days when the carbon of the whole power system is dropping and dropping and dropping. The electricity system operator, currently part of National Grid, that are on a path to independence, they can see a way to operate the power system at zero carbon in 2025. That's the kind of thing that in a conference of power system engineers, everyone stands up and cheers. It is massive. It is a massive, massive feat that they are on the path to do. So we've made such progress, but I think as Luke pointed out, we've got it all to do. And so there's two things that I like to remember. The first one is to be inspired by all that has been achieved. And the second one is to remember now is the moment to dial it right up to 11. Now is the time to really, really start driving it forward, and to think hard about how we will do this and how we will do it differently so that consumers can watch it happen and can dive in if they want, but that nobody is forced to worry about energy in a way that they aren't worrying about it now. Because energy is changing beyond recognition. And there's so much talk around what's happening, what's not, policy in, policy out. When I step back from it, I kind of start from the bottom up. Demand for electricity is set to double. There's no scenario that doesn't happen. We have a legally binding obligation to have a fully decarbonised electricity system by 2035. I will get the sack if I knowingly break the law. I also really, really passionately care about climate change and sustainability, and I work for an organisation that has that at its heart. We want to be the energy transition company. We want to make sure this can be a reality for everyone. And so we are driven by this obligation, but also by the purpose of the organisation. Is there a ban on petrol cars and diesel cars? Is there an expectation? How are we going to heat our homes? It doesn't matter what the law says. If you want to decarbonise, you have to change your thinking in these spaces. And as Luke has shown with lots of graphs that I loved, we have to change the energy mix as well. And that means that you have to be able to connect up more than ever before, and you have to think about the network very, very differently. Within National Grid at the moment in England and Wales, we are connecting 4.5 gigawatts per year, every year. So that's multiples of the new nuclear station that's going in at Hinkley. That puts us bang on track to deliver a decarbonised power system by 2035. That does not address at all the fact that the connections pipeline is full and the queues are long and new people come into the party are getting dates that they're not happy with. But we are doing a huge, huge, huge amount to put us on the right trajectory and to continue to give confidence to investors, to people who are coming into the market, that there is a way to do this and there is a network that will be ready to do this for them. The other bit that I always think it's worth just noting is, so when we say energy is changing, we have to think about network, we have to think about technologies, we have to think about roles, and we have to think about how change happens. So the energy network is beautifully complicated, and the energy infrastructure and the industry and the codes and the rules and the obligations are even more complicated. And change happens currently by consensus. So nothing moves until everybody is happy. And that means that you will have folks who are more reticent, or all of the nuance of different opinions means the whole thing can get locked up. And what we have to do is change how we change, and make sure that that new thoughts, new ideas can be unlocked really, really quickly, while still making sure it's transparent and it's fair, and that if you missed that one meeting, you didn't miss the day the industry moved without you. But there's lots of examples of how change is happening much quicker. We've been working with Ofgem, our regulator, around how we would do the connections process. And they agreed to give us new tools and a huge amount more space to work. Ordinarily, that would have been deep consultation. It would have been taking you to their board. It would have been a process. There would have been about 9 months of just meetings to talk about the thing we all wanted to do. But they said, no, actually just crack on. We're just going to take a risk on this and crack on. Got to give me some results at the end of it. And so we can see all of these really, really positive signs of how do we move forward. So as energy is changing, the grid also needs to change. And Dan mentioned this as well. So in the next 7 years, we have to build 5 times more, at least, than what has been done in the last 30 years. So why do we need to do this? I think Luke's maps were great in terms of showing where the offshore wind is going. The bit to remember is the network was built based on where there's coal fields. So it was all about get coal out of the ground, burn it, turn it into electricity, and send it to London, largely. That's how the network looked. And now we have to recognise that the point of production is very, very different. And you've got to be able to do that bulk transfer. So you need infrastructure where there hasn't been infrastructure before. And that is very difficult for people to agree with, to understand, to accept. If you're not in one of those locations and you recognise and you are more driven by sustainability and by clean air and by low carbon power, there's a real tension in that conversation around who hosts and who sees versus who benefits overall. And we're really conscious that we're right in the middle of that. that we will be building infrastructure that you will be able to see. The construction phase might be the more challenging bit, but we have to make sure that communities don't feel done to and they feel listened to all the way through this. The other bit that I'm quite conscious of is, so the system's been around for decades, and how we have, this isn't the first time we've built some new stuff. How you build is pretty well known, it's pretty well managed, you know who you're working with, you know what that looks like. How we will do this still has to be safe, still has to be managed, still has to work beautifully, but the known bit is very, very different. And this is where our massive opportunity for doing it completely differently comes in. And so we would have taken things one at a time in the past. What we're doing now is a whole campaign to do a great grid upgrade. So we will upgrade what we have, we will stretch what we've got, we will make sure every single bit of it is used to its maximum potential. And that means digital, that means commercial tools, that means new folks involved in conversations, while we try and build as fast as we ever can. And to do this, that means you need engineers who are surveying the landscape. You need people who are setting the technical specifications of things. You need people who are capturing the data. You have to expose the problem to more great minds so you can bring people close enough to ask the different question. Because through all of this big, big challenge to change the grid, our stakeholder expectations are pretty reasonably unchanged. People want it to be affordable, they want sustainability, nobody expects to flick a light switch and nothing to happen. It's got to be safe. People need to be able to come to work, do a great job, and go home safely. And the power system needs to be available. Like, if you're a generator, you have made power, you want to move it to market, you do not want to hear about, oh, sorry, there's leaves on the track, you can't get it to market. And so all of these expectations are unchanged, but how we will meet them, that's where we need to be super innovative, and that's where different partnerships need to happen. I'm quite conscious as well that even being here today shows that more people and different groups are interested in this conversation. If I cast my mind back to when I started at National Grid, engineers were like, oh, good, solid company, great. The rest of my friends were like, okay. And that has, over the years, that has been pretty static. Engineers like talking about engineering things, construction engineers like talking about construction, but now it is a much broader conversation. So I was really excited to be here. I'm like, this is brilliant. We can help people understand what we're trying to do and how important it is, and highlight where the opportunity to get involved and to bring new thinking and probably new to us, established thinking from other fields into that conversation. Because collaboration is absolutely key. We know we cannot do this alone. We have no right to do this alone. So how we will collaborate, how we will innovate, how we will rise to this challenge is absolutely massive. The number of skilled resources that we need. If we think just about overhead lines, so think about kind of one of the towers and one of the lines that you've seen at some point, to upgrade all that we need based on the people who are currently able to do that work will take you to 2040. Which is a good 10 years later than everybody needs it. And so we have to dramatically increase the number of people who can do that work. And that means got to train differently, you've got to attract them into the country differently, you have to be able to work at different times, all of these challenges. Talked a little bit about policy and regulation, materials and equipment, got to buy a lot of stuff. But from where? Could we build more of it in the UK? How do we make sure that the need is clear so that somebody further down the pipeline, somebody further down that value chain can see the opportunity with enough confidence to be able to make a big decision? Because these are big sums of money we're talking about. And people need to be able to see what is there with confidence to be able to dive in and get involved. Within that materials and equipment and within the specialist technology piece, one of the things that we're working quite hard on is how do you decide what that equipment is? And how do you specify it so that perhaps it won't break? Or if it does break, you don't have to do as much maintenance, you don't have to take as many actions. Traditionally, if you want to build a power system, the first thing you do is you switch a bit of it off, do some work, then you switch it back on. And you switch it off when the generator is off. And the generator is thermal, and they are following price signals. If you're an offshore wind provider, you don't turn off. You'll take one turbine out of a field of 50, And so our entire way of thinking about what equipment has to be able to do has to change. And so it's an awesome place to be. It's an awesome moment to be in engineering and to be in energy, and all of the great things that we can do with great people. So I'm going to finish on this collaboration point is absolutely key as we rise to this challenge, as we seek this opportunity. And remember, this is like our once in a lifetime shot to get it right. So thank you very much for having me. Dan, I'll pass back to you.
Well, thanks, Ro. That was brilliant, and I'd like to start by just welcoming the panelists back onto the stage, because we're going to now go into a bit of a panel session. But as we are phenomenally on time, and you can tell there's engineers involved in this, I thought I'd share. You've got four energy enthusiasts, if we're being polite, and geeks, if we're not, on stage, and the app of choice for energy geeks is the National Grid ESO app, which tells you exactly what is happening on the electricity system right now. So do you want to hear? It is presently 76% zero carbon, right? That is a phenomenal engineering accomplishment that we've done in this country. It's 76% zero carbon. 58% of the electricity that we're using right now is coming from wind power, 14% from nuclear. As if to prove the point about load patterns, only 2% is solar, but if you look outside, that should be no surprise to anybody. And only 13% is gas. Only 13% is gas. That's a pretty good day for zero carbon power. And so great day to be talking about this. And I'd encourage you all to download that and become energy geeks with us as well. Do think about your questions and stick your hand up if you've got a question for the panel. There is a mic or a couple of mics that will be floating around the room, so please do give us your questions. I'll kick us off with a question to each of the panelists. We're here in the headquarters of one of the most innovative companies in the world. We're all in pretty innovative spaces, so let's talk about a little bit about innovation and what the big innovation challenges you see in your part of the market, and why are they important. So, yeah, Merijn, maybe we should start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think in terms of, if we look at solar technology, it's quite a mature technology. So I think everyone's familiar with solar panels. We see them everywhere. So it's quite sort of a standardized design. And also, if we look at sort of the cost of solar energy, it's only dropping. Solar panels are becoming more efficient. So it's becoming even more affordable. At the same time, there's new solar technologies which are getting into the market right now. Some of them, what I mentioned about double land use, for example, there's solar panels which can be easily combined with agricultural activity. So, for example, bifacial panels, which are vertical panels, which can be used on farmland, and you can sort of drive in between those panels. So I think those type of designs are now coming up, as well as what they call trackers. So these are panels which you can move, and they can sort of adapt to the sun. So they will sort of move around during the day, which make them even more efficient in terms of how much electricity they can generate. So I think the design and technology for solar is now more being adapted to how we want to integrate the technology into the landscape, as well as on top of buildings. So I think that's probably something we're going to see a lot more in the next few years.
Thanks, Merijn. And Luke, what about from a wind power perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And obviously I touched on the challenges around innovation for floating offshore wind, but I think it's also worth pointing out that there's still pressure and commercial competition to get bigger and bigger turbines. You know, when I first went to one of our offshore wind conferences about 13 years ago, sorry, can you hear?
Yeah.
I remember going to a session about how big will turbines get, and was very authoritatively informed that the laws of physics mean a turbine can't get more than 20 megawatts. We're knocking on the door of that now, and I think part of part of the innovation that we've pursued rests on innovative materials, and can we make structures that are lighter while still being durable? How big can we go? So there's a lot of innovation happening in the material space, and there's also some challenges, some innovations around making those materials more sustainably and sourcing them sustainably and making turbines 100% recyclable, which we're pretty much there with the current generation that's coming through. And I think we're also looking, and the members that we work with primarily have been people who go and build wind farms. But as the energy system is changing, they're changing what they do, and we're changing with them. So you now have people developing wind farms, but also then pursuing what are the kind of long-term storage solutions, because we know pretty much how to get a clean energy system for about 95% of the time. The last 5% is quite tricky, and you're going to need storage solutions or generation assets that you don't use very often, and sometimes using sort of storage technologies that at the moment have only been tried on small scale, and how do we scale those up? Green hydrogen is the big one that everyone talks most about, and I think it's because it's most easily relatable. It's essentially a clean version of natural gas, but there's a huge innovation space around some of those storage solutions, giant flywheels and gravity-based solutions, compressed air, etc. Things that colleagues of mine in that space will talk at length about, but I'll leave it at that and pass to Ro.
Good idea.
I won't start straight there. I think actually where I will start though is with low carbon concrete. And why do I start with that? Because when we think about the energy system, attention is rightly drawn to big questions and big decisions. So hydrogen, how do you make sure that the technologies we're connecting are as innovative and continue to develop and grow? But if we're to do this, we need to think about all of the small pieces as well. So when you mentioned about materials, if things are lighter, you need less steel to hold it up. And so when we can go after all of the details along the chain, then you can just make the whole thing come together. And you squeeze out the space and you squeeze out the pounds, and you make it easier for a community to understand what they are left with was the very smallest or was the very least. So I think there's a piece for me around big innovation is vital. Small innovation is also vital as well. So the pieces come together to be more than some of their parts. The other bit I think that we need to talk on, it would feel remiss not to say it in Google, is data. Data. The more data we have, the more accessible it is, the more people who can do great thinking on it, the more AI that we can apply to that. Helps with efficiency, it helps with optimization, and it helps making sure that what you build, you can use all of the time. What you design, you are designing in that assumption of someone being able to do more with that than you expected at the time you put it in.
It's so relevant, the data point. I've got a little anecdote that I'd share about offshore wind, where when we develop and build a new wind farm, we have to analyse the habitats that you're building the wind farm in to see what impact it might have, quite rightly so. And the typical way that you do that is to count the number of species that there are. So you basically historically used fairly primitive methods of doing that. One company at the moment is using AI to put cameras under the surface of the sea to not only identify the species of fish that are there, but identify using AI the individual fish. So you don't double count a fish because you don't want to, So I mean, that's just for me as a sort of simple working in mechanical engineering most of my career. That is a fairly mind-blowing piece of technology, and it just shows you what can be done. I think I've got a couple of questions at the front here. Great. I was worried about the stony silence, but it seems like we're going to avoid it.
Honored to be the first question from the audience. Hi everyone, my name is Brian. I'm the head of sustainability at a local architecture and interior design practice. If I may, I have two questions. One, and forgive me, Merijn, was it? Yes, and Roisin. But first, Merijn. So on a micro scale, when we're trying to meet biodiversity goals on buildings, and we also need to put solar panels everywhere, we're now looking at the impact of planting planting an entire roof and then putting a solar panel on top of it, and the efficacy of that bit of roof underneath the panel. So on the macro scale, agricultural situation, can you talk to us a bit about if there's any impact on the biodiversity under those big fields that would then be covered from sunshine? What impact that has on agriculture or the land in general, even if it's not used for agriculture? And my question, Roisin, is about heat pumps. They're not plug and play. They're not silver bullets. And they're for sealed boxes. And if everyone's saying that in 2050, 80% of the buildings already exist today, is it right to put that as a KPI? And is it realistic in 2028 that we're actually going to do 600 a year? Are you just going to install them and then one day they're going to be plugged in? So I'm interested in knowing about the heat pump situation as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Actually, yesterday I attended a presentation by Solar Energy UK and a number of research institutions who were talking about the exact effect of solar farms on biodiversity. So probably if you want to really understand, you can visit our website and look up the research. But as I understand, it's a trade-off, but the general net effect is positive. So of course, the land below the solar panels will not have the same growth of grass or other plants compared to next to it. But generally, if you compare to sort of the base case of arable land, there will be a net positive effect of the solar farm. But again, it's something you can look up easily. Yeah.
If I take your question on heat, so just probably to clarify, so that was government ambition, and our role at National Grid is to make sure the network can handle it, so that if people want heat pumps, they can get them connected and the demand can be met. It's not our job to dictate how you heat your home. One of the things that we have said is that heat is really difficult. So exactly as you point out, so much of the building stock already exists. I live in London. If someone said to me that I had to kind of give up my spare room to put in Powerwall or to put in heating equipment, I'd have a view on that, that it's not actually a spare room. And so we've been quite conscious around how you tackle heat is key. And what is really important is that we do tackle heat. And that might mean that you'll have a heat network in an area. It might mean that you might have hydrogen involved in that. It might be heat pumps. I have one, love it. It's in the back of the garden, it's great. But we were putting it in at a point in time. It's not something you're just going to add on if you don't have underfloor heating. If you're leveling a building, go for it. But it's awesome, a big fan. So I think the key point for me on heat is it probably will be a patchwork of solutions. It is really important that people have the most control over what happens in their house and they don't feel done to in their own home. And the key piece for us at National Grid is to make sure the grid is not part of that conversation. So if you want a heat pump, you can have a heat pump. If you want something else, that you can have that. And that there isn't this, that we can be off the critical path of that is kind of the key piece for us when we think about the network.
Thanks, Rod. Can I just make one additional point on the land use point, which I think if my colleague from Solar Energy UK here was here, we would make, which is, and I definitely recommend the research they did about biodiversity, which is really, really good. If we build all of the solar panels at utility scale that we anticipate we will need to get to net zero, then that will use 0.4% of the land use of the available land in the UK, which is less than is currently used by golf courses. So just that's the equation. That's the equation.
Interesting fact there. My name is Ivor Tucker. I run a company called Generation C, which is about connecting the decarbonisation stories and things that you've all been talking about with schools and school kids, so that they get to understand that it's not all climate anxiety, but actually there's this vast range of innovations and solutions that are the future and that they could contribute, they can be part of a positive or an optimistic future. I'd be interested to know what you guys are doing in terms of engagement, because we talk about materials, we talk about skills, we talk about all the innovations. It's going to require a skilled workforce to deliver all of that. And at the moment, the current education system is disconnected from that. So what are the plans of your companies to connect much better with the schooling system to change the way we educate our kids so that they are much better prepared and and have the skills required when they for all these jobs that are coming up down the line.
Who wants to take that one first?
I'll go first.
Great question.
I'll go first. It's a brilliant question. And it is absolutely vital that we are building the right workforce for this. So I think I'll probably draw out some specific examples that we are doing, but then also what's the bigger conversation. So London Power Tunnels, we're rewiring the capital. There's a really big tunnel that goes across the north of London, and there's one that's in construction kind of around the south. And within both of those projects, we did huge amounts with the local community with school children. So hundreds of thousands of school children got to come, got to see it. These are massive projects. It's the kind of thing you stand in and you look up and you think, oh, wow. And part of the reason for that was to get people excited about what this looks like and what it feels like, but then also to show them it's not every job isn't in a hard hat in mud somewhere. All the design work, all of the jobs around that to really, really kind of excite the mind when they were young. So we do that on all our major kind of projects. We'll create a visitor centre, we'll create an opportunity for the local community to get involved to see it. The other piece that we're then doing is looking at, so what are the community benefits that we should be thinking about, and how should we think differently about that as we go forward on this great programme of grid expansion and grid upgrade. And so, one local community said to us, if one more person comes to me and offers me a swimming pool, I don't need a swimming pool, I need a maths teacher. And so we're trying to work with communities around, so what do they need that will help them? But then also, how do you partner with our supply chain around, so if we all kind of put money into a pot, what would that look like and what would you do with it? Would you create a hub for construction engineers near a port that would kind of then really unlock regeneration in that area and give people sight of a good quality job that they will be able to do and their children might be able to do and kind of regrow generational style jobs. Worked very closely with EDF, who have done some amazing work in Hinckley around job creation, building a college and making sure that there's a real positive impact in the community after the construction work is finished. So that's some of it. But it's a really big conversation that we're having with our supply chain partners and with government around how do we get ready for this, and how is this the moment that people look back on and say, yeah, that was awesome. That was the moment that we changed so many things, and there were so many benefits that came from the decarbonisation of the power system.
Yeah, I'll take that. So I think there's a few different levels to this for us in the wind sector. Particularly with offshore wind being the big growth area in the next 5 to 10 years, as per the presentation. We currently employ around 33,000 people in the UK in the offshore wind sector. That needs to head towards about 100,000 by the end of the decade to meet where we need to go. To date, as an industry, we need to coordinate that. We're developing strategies to cover how we scale up to the levels that we need and the different types of skills that we need. And we see if you open, as many of our companies do, open apprenticeship schemes for people who want to become wind turbine technicians. Usually we take school leavers or people transitioning from other sectors, train them up. That for each application, we'll get dozens. For each opening, we'll get dozens of applications. There's no shortage of people who want to do that. But there are other areas where we're starting to see skills being strained, where already there are shortages coming through. And I think this speaks to the cross-cutting nature of what we're doing. And Ro, you put together a really compelling picture of across the energy sector what we're trying to do to decarbonise, and a large part of decarbonisation is electrifying things. So we'll need to be using a lot more electricity, and the skills that we need to build offshore wind farms, a lot of those are also skills that are going to be needed for the transformation of the grid. And so we're starting to all compete for a similar set of skills from a limited pool. So actually part of the strategy is about how we work together to build that kind of broader picture of what the skills needs are, and then working with those other sectors and crucially with government to put in place the through flow from the education system to meet that need. Because to date in the offshore wind sector, it's been almost entirely private investment that has built that workforce. Companies taking in school leavers, people transitioning, and people coming out of higher education as well. You know, you have a company like Scottish Power, for instance. They're able to look across their portfolio and, you know, do an intake of up to 1,000 people. So we're seeing a lot of leadership from individual companies. I think the next stage is the scaling and coordination.
Right.
I think, looking at our company, the majority of our employees is between 20 and 30. So we already see it's really popular now to work in renewable energy as your first job. We're also working with some schools and universities to provide people to do research within our organization and to do internship. So in that sense, I think, we're trying to make this connection with educational institutions. I do see an opportunity with school children, like at a younger age, to create some awareness there. So I think that's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, if I just add one personal thing and a plea to people, I have this thing about the misuse of the word engineer in the United Kingdom specifically, and I used to work for a German company, and in Germany, being an engineer is in society is considered with the same standing as maybe being a lawyer or a doctor, and certainly I think that's true of many other countries around the world. If our dishwasher breaks, we call an engineer. And that isn't to say that isn't an important role. It is an important role, but it's a technical career, and we need to distinguish between technicians and engineers, because when I speak to young people, and we've got a problem in our sector and actually common in engineering. I mean, about 20% of the people who work in offshore wind are female, and that is, you know, it's not acceptable, and it needs to be fixed in the long run. But when I speak to young women, and you say, what does being an engineer mean to you? Is an attractive career? The assimilations that they make in their mind is not necessarily the one that we want people to understand it to be. This is a really exciting career. You heard it from Ro. I mean, it's incredible change making that we're doing with real impact. So we want people to understand that. So please, if you say the word engineer, say it in the context of that kind of change maker, please. We've probably got time for one more question. Oh, it's on its way.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So it's Shalene Church. I'm a materials consultant from 540 World. So the question is both to Luke and Ro about materials specifically. So from the perspective of Cradle to Cradle certified, which is the highest standard for materials, I'm sure you both know it well. Are you incorporating that sort of level of materials selection in your materials searches and swaps? And also to Merijn.
Difficult.
I know that there's now flexible solar and there's cradle-to-cradle certified solar. Are you going that direction too? And just a completely mad thought, what about slumping your solar over your wind towers? So on the sunny days, the columns are also grabbing solar. But yeah, very interested in the materials, and we'd love to talk about that later too.
Let's go, Ro.
Cool. So I would need to check if we are doing full kind of cradle to cradle as you describe it. We have a series of responsible business commitments because we're very conscious of how we build is as important as the change that we enable. And we have tagged them and kind of recently relaunched them to make sure that they are linked to science, and they are linked to, we wanted to make sure that we didn't say something that was daft and crazy that we couldn't therefore be credible around doing. And so we've relaunched that to make sure that it was linked to science and it was in line with the science-based targets. Sorry, that was a phrase I couldn't think of. We are then quite conscious when we work with our supply chain partners on who's actually buying what, where is it coming from, do we understand that, and are we holding ourselves to really high standards around ethics in terms of who we work with and where things come from. And it gets very complicated quite quickly, particularly when you think about the scale of contracts and where do obligations move through it. So we're really conscious of our obligations. As I say, we have a responsible business commitment that we've published and are held to. Our investors are very keen on this as well to make sure that they understand that. But really happy to pick up on the details and possibly connect you with a colleague who will be able to give you a more correct answer.
Yeah, and similarly in the wind sector, we have major manufacturers. We have like Siemens and Vestas and GE who dominate particularly in the offshore space, and obviously they have very strong commitments to sustainably sourced supply chains. I think the interesting question that Ro sort of alluded to is how much transparency we're able to get reaching further back, and also within our supply chain for offshore wind, there are a lot of smaller players as well. And so I think one of the roles that we have as an industry body is to bring everyone with us on the transition and make sure that people understand what the highest possible standards are and help them overcome barriers or lack of information to implementing them. And that's part of the work that I'm going to be doing in our industrial strategy work that I mentioned previously, is trying to make sure that we're, as an industry, really setting and abiding by the highest standards and thinking about critical minerals and where they come from, how we source them. So it would be really good to pick up that conversation with you.
Yeah, I think for solar panels, we're looking into like innovative technologies. There's actually a Dutch company called Solarge, and they're now producing like cradle-to-cradle solar panels, and we're starting a pilot with them specifically for rooftop solar. That being said, still economic viability is quite a challenge there, because you need to have like large-scale production before the panels can compete with like the Chinese produced panels. So, but I think there's definitely an opportunity, especially in Europe as well, to sort of be at the forefront of innovation on this topic. So I think, yeah, for us, it's definitely something we're looking into, and we're following all those innovations. In terms of solar panels on wind turbines, I'm actually not sure. Maybe it would be a nice innovation, so we should look into it.
I'd like to see it, definitely.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, from being beautifully on time, we've gone over a little bit, so we are now eating into your coffee breaks. But look, from me, just to wrap up, this is a really, really exciting space. If it's a place where there's an awful lot of change happening, and we're affecting a lot of change quietly in the background, and as hopefully the statistics about today's energy showed you at the beginning, we've made an awful lot of impact already. Please speak to us, get in touch if you'd like to learn more, and just leaves me to thank Ro, Luke and Merijn for their time and for their contributions. And I think we are now going to coffee, if I'm right on that. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for holding off until the end of the day. I know we are the ones who are stopping you from going to either the pub or just leaving work early, so thank you for holding up. My name is Gihan Hyde, and I will be your moderator and chair for this panel. The panel, as you know, is called Sustainable Investment. We are all about where does the money come from, how is it coming from, and how do we bring everything that we've talked about previously to life. Before I begin and give you the context, I'm going to introduce you to me personally, because I love talking about myself. Love it. Who doesn't? Actually, I don't. So I am the founder and CEO of Communique. We are a B Corp certified ESG consultancy, meaning that we help organizations to embed sustainability within their business model, communicate it effectively, clearly, and transparently. But most importantly, for me personally, what's the biggest impact I have personally is how to train your employees and your stakeholders to understand how can they play a role in your sustainability and ESG journey. We are based in the UK, but none of my team, except one, Emily, are in the UK. We're all from underdeveloped countries and underrepresented communities. I sit on the B Corp UK board as their equitable growth advisor. I'm also the sustainability mentor for Accenture's Innovation Lab. Sit on the board of Money 2020, and I am LinkedIn top ESG voice for the UK. We're only 10. apparently. Which is sad, to be fair. What else? Why are we here today? Throughout the panel, I have my amazing 3 esteemed panelists with me. Each one of them are going to tackle sustainable investment from different angles. But before that, I actually want to demystify what they're about to say for the poor souls who are not from that background. And throughout the panel, you'll hear ESG investment. You will also hear impact investment. What do they mean and how do they differ from each other? ESG investment or sustainable investment is all about the data and the risks that are, let me figure. It's all about the data that investors actually look at to understand if your company is operating in a way that has a positive impact on environment, social, and how is it being governed. It came to life in 2004 by the UN, by the International Finance Commission, and by the Swiss government. So it's a government-led initiative. And the reason they created sustainable investment is because they were trying to help the financial institutions to make the better decision in investing in companies. When you look at ESG reports, i.e. the risks associated within environmental and social impact, you will find it's always backward looking. So it's about what the company did last year to mitigate the risks. When it comes to impact, investment is completely different. It was built out of the Rockefeller Foundation, a bunch of investors and philanthropists who said, actually, we want a better way of investment, and we want to have a better way of making investment decisions. So how do we do that? We're going to create an initiative called the Global Impact Investment, what is it called? I forgot.
Network.
Thank you. GIN, short for GIN. I hate acronyms.
GIN's a good one, though.
It is a good one, actually. A GIN, amazing. Impact investment is all about forward-looking. And it's all about resilience. So what's the resilience of the company? What's the intentionality of the company? And how is it being measured? So it's all about the measurement of your services and your products that you're offering. Okay, so these are the two differences. So I want you to just think of this. ESG and sustainable investment is the framework. Impact investment is the strategy of where your money is actually going to be placed and where is it going to be invested in. That's all I'm going to leave you with for now, because the panelists will walk you through the details of each one of them. So I will first introduce my first panelist, Sarah Teacher, from the Sarah is from the Impact Investment Institute.
Oh, you've got it, Gina.
And I have it.
Thank you.
So yes, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Hi everyone, lovely to be here. And now I feel next to Gihan's amazing silver shoes and blue skirt. I feel like a real drab city bod. So next time I'll remember that we're in Google and everyone dresses in cool jeans. So I'm Executive Director at the Impact Investing Institute. We are a non-profit that was founded in 2019 with the modest vision to change capital markets so they're fairer and work better for people and planet. And we do this by accelerating the growth of impact investing, which I will explain now. So we've had a bit of introduction from Gihan about what impact investing is, but in my 10 mins or so, I'm going to give you a broader sense of what impact investing is and what the market is, why it's so exciting, and some of the trends. So,
Sarah, just be careful the water underneath.
Be careful of the water.
Yes.
Aha. The first banana skin. So, definitions. We're very lucky because Gihan already brought you into this. But this in 2006, 2007, this is the definition that was reached by the Rockefeller Foundation and a set of other foundations that came together to frame this concept. So they defined impact investing as investments made with the intention to generate positive, measurable, social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. A kind of very simple idea. And Gihan's given you a bit of a flavour that this is that this world of impact investment sits on a spectrum. So I'm going to unpack that definition a little bit for you. So you can see on the right-hand side, right to left, x-axis, you have traditional financial approaches. So traditional investment approaches optimize for financial return, and they don't consider impact. If you go all the way to the other end, you have philanthropy, which is totally obsessed with impact and doesn't care about financial return at all, to such an extent that it's happy to lose all of the money for the sake of creating impact. And between those two extremes, and over the last 20 years, has been this ever-evolving space. So you have responsible investment. Responsible investment is typically anchored in screening stuff out. So you don't want to invest in armaments, in smoking, in alcohol, in gambling. Those are the classic sin stocks. So that's the classic responsible investing approach. So you're already starting to have some kind of impact reflection there. Next on is sustainable investing, which Gihan mentioned. That's where you are interested in the environmental, social, and governance of your underlying investments, but you're interested in how they affect your financial performance. So you're interested if they find child labour in the supply chain and there's a consumer outrage, my stock will fall. When you get to the world of impact investing, you're actually interested in using environmental, social factors to target specific outcomes and contribute solutions. So here we have the three pillars of impact investing. Intentionality. So distinct from managing risks of environmental and social performance, you go into an investment seeking a specified environmental or social outcome. I want to lift women out of poverty. I want to decrease recidivism rates. I want to increase the number of affordable housing units. So you go in thinking that. So that's principle number one, intentionality. Principle number two is measurability. If you're interested in increasing affordable units, lifting women out of poverty, then you have to chase that data point through to ensure that your investment yielded that outcome. So intentionality and measurability. And then the third area is this concept of additionality. Impact investing is harder work than normal investing. You're wrapping around this new layer of care because you really want to know what the real world outcome is of that investment. So you have to hope that all of this stuff adds up to more than a conventional investment. So that's the third principle, additionality. And what I'll share with you now is that a lot of people think of impact investing as very specific types of asset classes. But this is an approach, it's a way of thinking about investment that's distinct and different. All investments have impact. It's whether you're measuring it or not. It doesn't matter the company. Any company you invest in will be doing some good stuff, it will be doing some bad stuff. The principle behind impact investing is we're seeking to ramp up the good stuff and reduce the bad stuff, and using a for-profit business model through which to do that.
So that's very simple, really. And this market, well, I mean, it is growing for various reasons. So in the UK, we size the UK impact investing market, which is actually really hard to do, by the way. Really a very difficult project. But and we sized it at £58 billion. So this is a market that's small relative to global capital markets, but not so small that it's inconsequential. The GIN, the so-called GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, sized the global impact investing market at $1 trillion. A drop in the ocean relative to the broader capital markets, you know, basically we're in 1% territory, but you know, that's still a big number. And let me tell you, there is a lot that has produced that market size and will continue to see its development. So the first is obvious, right? We are living in a time of the poly crisis. So the acuity of the crisis, the acuity of climate change, the acuity of social inequality, the acuity of continuing poverty in the global south and within developed contexts means that financial services is being asked to respond. We're trying to bring our systems in step with reality. That's why I always think it's so strange when people contest sustainability. Sustainability is a set of facts about the direction that the world is going in. And these strategies, these efforts, are an attempt to try and bring our human systems into step with the realities that we're facing. So government is also acting as a result. So this is actually quite deep cuts for this audience, but so the UK government, the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, is trying to understand, is introducing things called sustainability disclosure requirements for investors. So asset managers need to share if they're having sustainable products, to be clear with consumers about what those might be. And on a bigger scale, you can see things like the IRA in the US. These are massive subsidies to climate, to renewable energies and climate-friendly technologies that are happening. In the EU, we have something called the EU Green Taxonomy. We have the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. There's a whole lot of hard wiring that governments are putting in place to try and encourage finance to be in step with sustainability realities, trying to encourage really private capital to deliver public policy outcomes. And there's also a real hunger from individuals, from citizens who are becoming more aware that their finance has an impact. And particularly if you are millennial or down, I've just snuck into the millennial generation by the skin of my teeth. But if you, like me, have just snuck in, you've basically been aware of climate change your whole life. And so the idea of purpose and profit really go hand in glove. And we're going to hear from Sarah Kay in a minute about the different ways that financial services are responding, and in particular, coming together on lots of voluntary initiatives to try and drive change. So all of these different tendrils are coming together to create this idea of intentional finance that contributes solutions to social and environmental problems. And there, Peter Harrison, Andy's boss, there's a quote from him talking about the importance of impact investing and the role it will play within capital markets. Typically, people have thought of this as a concessionary space, a place. It started in philanthropy. It looks a bit like philanthropy. It doesn't. It's part of the global capital markets. It is the future of finance, and it's a very exciting place to be. So what does institutional market rate product look like? I realize, again, I might have slightly misjudged this crowd. But I guess the point of this, usually we're a bit more sort of deep cut financial services. the tradition of thinking about impact investing is that these are, for example, loans to charities, concessionary. You won't really get a financial return, you will get a deep impact. But this market has evolved to deliver scale product that major institutional investors like pension funds, insurers, family wealth vehicles can come and be a part of. So just to give you a flavour of a couple there, you can see the pithily named Global Sustainable Income Fund 2, which is a £300 million private debt fund that invests in SMEs. So there it's focused on the global south in sub-Saharan Africa. It's invested in by a faith pension fund called Christian Super from Australia. And the idea there is that, for example, a $5 million loan to a grain processor enables the surrounding SMEs to process their grain quicker, to employ more people, spurs economic development, and that's the kind of impact thesis. So you can see it's seeking to drive jobs, wage growth, and actually in that particular investment, lots of the farmers are women, so there's a gender dimension too. So what you see across the piece is large-scale financing vehicles that now are delivering a positive impact and a financial return. Oh, here we go. So one of the mythologies around impact investing is what return profile can you get? And so this is some stats from the GIN. Just as an aside, there's also another organization in our field called Tonic. So you can see what you can see that the impact investing community likes a few jars. But anyway, impact investing primarily targets market rate returns and is delivering on those returns. So as you can see there, 67% of people who play in impact investing, this is the annual survey that the GIN does, are targeting risk-adjusted market rate returns. So they're looking for a market rate return. You can see that obviously there's a kind of third of the market that's looking at concessionary returns, but 2/3 of the market is looking for risk-adjusted market rate returns. And then you can see even more excitingly that the lion's share of people are actually succeeding in delivering those returns. So 88% are either outperforming or in line with that financial return profile. And, cherry on top, 99% of them are meeting their impact expectations. So if you take a step back, this is a field in which 67% of the field is getting the same risk-adjusted market rate return that people are getting in their commercial investment portfolios, but delivering affordable housing, lifting women out of poverty, educating kids, doing amazing, dazzling things that make the world a better place environmentally and socially. You can see why it's a pretty exciting field to be in. So I'm just going to close by giving you a sense of who is in this world and how optimistic and excited I am for its growth. So this field started with private foundations. So charitable foundations, they give money over here, about 4% of what they are. 96% of what they are is invested in the global capital markets. And traditionally, they hadn't thought about, maybe we could have an impact in those commercial investments. In this country, there's £84 billion worth of charitable foundation investments. What an exciting opportunity for impact. But just to give you an example, here in London, Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation is a health charity. It has £1 billion endowment, and they have committed to deliver health impacts across their endowment. What that means in practice is that they're investing in medtech, they're investing in affordable housing because of the social determinants of health, and they're investing in their listed markets in responsible investing strategies that challenge the businesses they're invested in to do things like better calorie disclosure or reduce their calorie footprint. So that's the foundation sector. Pension funds. So in this country, in the UK alone, there's £3.6 trillion worth of money locked up in pensions. That's our money. It's one of these incredible sort of blind spots that we all have as individuals, that we're the biggest pool of capital there is, and it's our money. And we see increasingly that those people who act on our behalf, our fiduciaries, are starting to allocate for impact. So lots of the local government pension schemes, so Camden's just there, I imagine Camden's doing cool stuff for you, and faith pension funds are starting to allocate impact investing. Family offices are also a really interesting player in this market. So there's $10 trillion globally in family-owned hands, and increasingly, lots of those mega families are starting to bring their values across their wealth. And I think of a really an amazing family in Italy. In fact, you were just learning about sustainable fashion. There's a family office called PFC. They're majority owners of Hugo Boss, for example, and they are starting to deliver impact investing through their family office approach. We see social investors also playing a role here. If you're interested to learn more, you should go and check out Big Society Capital, who invest in really astonishing things like the Women in Safe Homes Fund. They invest in affordable housing units that are made accessible to women fleeing domestic violence. For every unit that's invested in, that's a woman safe from violence. Pretty simple, spine-tingling business model. UK banks are starting to play a role. So Lloyds Banking Group is doing lots of work in what's called the Community Development Finance Institution sector. And finally, we'll hear from Andy shortly about some of the work that's going on in Schroders. So I'm going to stop there. But just to say, this is a really exciting field. Now within mainstream financial services, in every single one of the City of London's mainstream asset managers, there is a corner of impact. There's a bigger wedge of ESG, but there's a corner of impact. So if you have a set of investments, if you have well, you all have pensions, using your pension, using your personal investments if you have, you can really start to talk to and challenge the people that manage your money and own your money to do amazing things with it. Because there is a field that has grown up to try and cater to and answer this kind of urge that we all have, and this approach to finance that will help it be an ally to the sustainability crises that we're all in, rather than a kind of, well, I can't think of the right word, but an unhelpful inhibitor of progress. So I'll leave it there. And I think I just did kick over that glass of water, so perfect.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. That is very informative. And by the way, I don't have a pension, actually. It's a serious problem. I actually need to figure out how I do. Yes. So yes, as Sarah has walked us now through the impact investment. Now let's see what the UN Net Zero Banking Alliance are doing in that space, and then we'll hear from Schroders. And and this is Sarah Kay.
Thank you.
Oh no! Before you move, this gave me a heart attack. Actually, I'm going to move this one.
Thank you.
Yes, just in case you decide.
Hi everybody, it's really great to be here
need to look
today.
into it.
Really good to speak to you all. My name's Sarah Kemmitt. I work for the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative, or UNEP-FI, as we call it. I've been with them for about 3 years. Prior to that, I had a decade as a financial regulator with the Bank of England, and prior to that, I had a couple of decades as an environmental scientist. So this role for me brings everything together in the right place. What is the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative? Well, it's a partnership between the UN Environment Programme and the private finance sector. And the way that we work is by co-creating frameworks for sustainability and impact. And I'm here today to talk about one of those programs, which is the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So we formed the Alliance in April 2021. It was launched at the Biden Climate Summit, and it was really in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow. So why did we create the Net Zero Banking Alliance? Well, prior to it being in existence, banks were just starting to make some net zero commitments, but they were all so incredibly different. Some of them really only referred to the bank's own operations. Some of them were, scratching the surface in some areas. Some of them were very vague when you really got into them. And what we realised is that we needed a kind of a gold standard for what does a net zero commitment mean for a bank. And the IPCC had done a report in 2018 which really emphasised the difference in outcome between a world where we have 2 degrees of warming compared to a world where we have 1.5 degrees of warming. And the difference is immense. So in the lead up to COP26, the ambition started to galvanise around limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that means approximately halving CO2 emissions every decade out to 2030. So that was really what prompted us to do it. We heard earlier about the opportunities there. The opportunity is massive, because to achieve this transition to a net zero economy, we really need to be investing about 4 trillion a year. And you heard from Sarah T just before that the impact investing market globally is around $1 trillion. There's green bond markets, there's all sorts of different categories of impact investing. But we know that there is, there's a huge gap there. But that also means there's a massive, massive opportunity. But we know that public finance can't do that on its own. So public finance has to be complemented by private finance to achieve this transition. And banks have a massive role to play in this. Their operational emissions are not that big, really. So a bank has data centres, it has a branch network, it has offices. The executives travel maybe by first class air sometimes, but their own operations aren't that big in terms of emissions. But what's huge is their financed emissions. So those financed emissions through what they're facilitating in the real economy can be 700 times greater than their operational emissions. And for many banks, it wouldn't surprise me if it was vastly bigger than that. So there's this massive opportunity for banks to really leverage their client relationships and to really drive that change in the real economy. So we launched the Alliance with 43 founding members in April 2021. We're now up to about 136 banks. We're one of the most geographically diverse alliances, in that we've got banks represented from over 40 countries, which is really fantastic. And those banks overall control about 74 trillion of total assets, which is huge. That's about 41% of global banking assets. So there's really a major opportunity here to prompt the systemic change that we need. Before we had the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we don't think that any banks had actually set sectoral decarbonisation targets that were scientifically aligned to 1.5, and we now have 96 of our members have set such targets. So huge, huge progress. Obviously a lot further to go. And I just want to mention that we are part of a bigger kind of net zero arena. You heard from Sarah T about some of the other initiatives. At the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative, we have our flagship banking initiative is called the Principles for Responsible Banking. And that covers the Sustainable Development Goals in a much broader sense. And that requires members to do an impact analysis, looking at positive and negative impact across all of the Sustainable Development Goals, really, and many different impact areas. The Net Zero Banking Alliance is laser focused on climate mitigation. That's all we do, climate mitigation. We're not looking at adaptation, we're not looking at other things, but obviously there are a whole host of very intersectional issues like the just transition, human rights, nature and biodiversity. They all come into it, but our focus is really on decarbonisation. And NISBA, as I call it, is it's the sector-specific alliance within the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. So some of you may have heard of GFANS. I think GFANS has a higher profile than NISBA because it was launched by Mark Carney actually on the same day that we launched the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And that is a kind of umbrella initiative. So that is, it covers all the sectors of the finance sector. So the aim of GFANS is really to make sure that the whole of the financial sector is fit for purpose to support the transition to a net zero economy by 2050 and to ensure that climate mitigation and climate is taken into account in every single financial transaction. So there are alliances for asset managers, asset owners, financial service providers, venture capital. We are the banking limb of GFANS. So one thing I just wanted to cover off, and I'm afraid the clock has stopped, so if I'm drawing near, can you draw my attention to it? One thing I wanted to flag is this concept of double materiality. So some of you may not really have heard of this, but when it comes to climate change, it really started with Mark Carney's speech in 2015 at Lloyd's of London, where he talked about the financial risk to banks and other financial institutions from climate change. And that was what really made the financial sector wake up. That's what we call the outside-in perspective. So if you're sitting in a bank, you might think, oh gosh, we might lose an awful lot of money because there's all these physical risks from climate change that could impact us and could impact the value of the collateral against the loans that we've made. Or there are transition risks where some of our clients might end up with irrelevant business models because of policy change or technological innovation around climate. And so when I was in regulation, I was very involved in helping banks to analyse and understand that financial materiality. And the way that you do that is through stress testing, because you don't have any data to any past data on which to base this. So you do forward-looking scenario analysis. Once you've done that forward-looking scenario analysis, you think, well, what can we do to mitigate those risks? And you very quickly come to the conclusion the only way that we can actually mitigate those risks is if we look at our impact and take the inside-out perspective and think, well, what impact are we making on the outside world? Because it's senseless to be managing the risks from climate change if we're actually financing all of the activity that's going to bring that climate change about. So this is a really important kind of concept in sustainable finance, and that's why voluntary initiatives like the Net Zero Banking Alliance have come about to really help those financial institutions to think about the impact that they're making and how to kind of solve for that. So why would a bank voluntarily sign up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance? I think one good reason is to prepare for mandatory regulation. We know that this is going to come. And you'll have seen this in the UK, where the Transition Plan Task Force has just put out guidance and will be bringing in regulation that large corporates have to have a transition plan to cope with the transition to a net zero economy. And there's lots of other regulation around disclosure, etc., and targets. The other reason is to manage those risks from climate change. But really importantly, with those risks, they open up a huge wealth of opportunity to really help their clients with the transition. And the third reason is to unlock finance. So to get access to those markets, those impact investment markets, to work with multilateral development banks, to create blended finance structures to help to mobilise capital to emerging markets and developing countries. So there are many reasons why a bank would want to sign up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance. But what they're signing up to, I'd like to stress, is very, very challenging. And in many cases, they are going well ahead of governments in their commitment. So they have committed to net zero by 2050 and interim targets for 2030 or sooner. That covers all of their on-balance sheet lending and investing. And we are looking at off-balance sheet activities such as capital markets, facilitated emissions. They have to set sectoral targets for 9 very high emitting sectors. And they have to set some targets within 18 months of signing up, and then a full set of targets within 36 months of signing up. That might sound slow to you, but for a bank to do this work, it's highly technical. It takes a long time to do the carbon accounting, to deal with all the data issues, to understand the scenarios, to set the targets, to take them through governance. They have to be signed off at the senior executive level and reviewed by the board. This all takes a lot of time. And they have to set their targets based on a 1.5 science-based scenario, which is low or no overshoots. So we're really trying to avoid overshooting the 1.5 target. They also have to report annually on their progress against targets and take a robust approach to the use of offsets in their transition plans. So it is incredibly ambitious. The whole commitment is set out in a 2-page commitment statement and some guidelines for climate target setting for banks, which set all of the requirements out. So I think what I'd like to wrap up with is 5 key features of what this commitment is. So it is systemic. They really are putting themselves at the core of systemic change that's really needed to transition this whole economy. And it's very holistic. So we heard before from Sarah T that in many investment organisations, impact investing is a small corner of what they do. What this alliance is doing is absolutely mainstreaming it because they have to look at the whole of their portfolio. They can't just take a little bit of it or say, oh, we've got a green financing target, we're going to do 100 million of green financing. They have to look across their whole portfolio, do the carbon accounting and work out how they're going to get that down to net zero. So they have to look across geographies, different asset classes. It's really challenging. It's science-based, so they commit to using scenarios that are approved by the IPCC, or at least credible and well-recognised 1.5 scenarios. And they also commit to a very high level of transparency. So they have to show what they're doing here. And the disclosure requirements that they have signed up to are actually quite significant and quite high. So, you know, they have to disclose publicly their targets, their baselines, their emissions, what they're doing, their transition plans. And so it really is a very big undertaking. But the important thing is immediacy. So I think when people started talking about net zero by 2050, the major criticism was, well, you're just kicking the ball into the long grass. This is a long way off. Our members have to set targets for 2030 or sooner, which may sound quite a long way off to some of you, but actually it's 7 years away. They're going to have to work out how to halve the emissions across their balance sheet. This is it's very different for banks because banks have very long-term relationships with their clients. They're not just buying and selling securities like stocks and shares or bonds in liquid markets. They've got these very kind of deep relationships with their clients. So, you know, it really is quite immediate, and they really need to engage with their clients on their business models. So, I will stop there, and we'll
Thank
go
you.
through, and then we'll look at some questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. I think what really resonated with me here, other than the fact that the banks have to move quickly, is the double materiality. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, if your organizations do issue sustainability reports or ESG reports, you will find a section called materiality assessment. This is where your company will be talking about what is really important to them and what will be affecting their operations. But it also informs how your communications, if you're in the communication sphere, it will inform how would you communicate your sustainability, because the materiality will be divided into the most critical, to the medium critical, to the least critical. So you can actually tie your narrative together using the materiality assessment. So I really do advise you to just look at your organization's materiality assessment. Last but not least is Andrew Howard from Schroders.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I'm Andy Howard. I'm the Global Head of Sustainable Investment at Schroders. For those that might not be too familiar, Schroders, we're a global asset manager. So we kind of manage people's pensions, we manage money for insurance companies, we manage funds for people directly for savings that they might have and the like. In total, to use this same reference points that we've talked about before, we manage about $1 trillion, roughly speaking, for different kinds of clients in different parts of the world, of which a small corner similarly, and a growing but still relatively small corner, is in impact investment. A much bigger part is in sustainable investment. But really what I was going to try and frame today a little bit around is this isn't about the corners, whether they're big corners or small corners. Ultimately, it's about how we think about the way we manage money, how we think about finance, both the role of finance in the real world and also the way in which the real world is impacting finance. And they're not two entirely separate questions, they're incredibly closely linked. I will do the mandatory, the mandatory advertising slide, which I won't dwell on. We're quite big, we're reasonably good at this, as you might expect from an advertising slide. And we're a relatively large organisation. But the points that I would sort of probably spend more time on, we talk about climate change, and there's still this tendency to talk about climate change as being something that you choose to get exposure to. You look on your list of funds, and there's some of them are called climate change funds, some of them aren't, as though this is somehow a choice about whether do we want to have exposure to climate change. And the reality is that we're all exposed to climate change in the finance industry. Sarah made the point in terms of banking. This isn't about how do we have a few little business lines that are somehow doing something in this area. It's ultimately about what is this going to mean for how we run our business and the point of our business at its very heart. So what we've shown here are a couple of charts. The left-hand chart shows the number of countries around the world that have made some form of net zero commitments. I say some form because they do vary quite a bit from legally binding through to sort of a bit more aspirational. But to put it in context, you've moved from a situation in 2016, 2017, so just after the Paris Accord, where global leaders got together and agreed to limit long-run temperature rises to 2.5 degrees, aim for 1.5 degrees, which is a huge ask. This is not a straightforward question. But at the time you had 2-3% of the world's economy had actually committed to doing the same thing. That's now about 90%. So roughly speaking, countries that represent about 90% of the world's economy or about 90% of the world's carbon emissions have committed to reaching net zero over the next few decades. Timeframes vary, mostly by about 2050. You're seeing companies respond to that. So the right-hand chart shows you the number of companies with net zero commitments. There are more companies than this that have made commitments to cut their emissions reasonably aggressively at varying degrees. But either way, it's picking up pretty sharply in terms of seeing that response. So from our point of view, this isn't simply a question of, well, let's try and think about how we want to build products that are reflecting this. The reality is that it is looking increasingly likely that whether we get to net zero or not, the momentum behind tackling climate change at a political level, at a social level, and social, I think in this context is probably more important, is starting to build. We are starting to see action from different places. We need to think about what does that mean for our business, both in terms of the risks that we have in the portfolios that we're managing today, but also in terms of the kinds of portfolios, the kinds of assets that we should be making available to our clients in the future. And I think as a sort of slight aside, and we've talked a little bit about finance and banking and so on, but it's sort of worthwhile stepping back and thinking, what's the point of finance? Not an entirely rhetorical question. Ultimately, the point of our industry is to connect capital, savings, excess amounts of money that people have built up somewhere to areas of need in the real world, and in doing so, to generate a return. Because if you can tackle something which needs tackling, if you can solve a problem that the world really has, in general, that's not a bad way of generating some kind of economic return, some kind of profit on that investment. And in general, investing in things that don't have some real world benefit is probably not a very sustainable kind of return. And fundamentally, there are few bigger problems in the world than climate change, nature loss. The broad suite of sustainability challenges are, to my mind, define the problems that the world faces. And our industry, frankly, has done a not great job of figuring out how to connect all the capital to areas of need. And that's not just because we should or an altruistic question. Fundamentally, that's what will allow the finance industry to be successful and to thrive in the future, is by solving problems in the real world. None of us have worked this out. We are all, I hope, trying to figure this out, and I think certainly at Schroders I'll say we're on a journey. It's a terrible phrase, but we're on a journey. But I think certainly we're asking the right questions and we're trying to tackle this in the right way. This is also slightly theoretical. So when we talk about countries have made commitments, companies have made commitments, great. Close to home, we've also got commitments. The actual commitment to the commitment tends to waver a little bit, as we've spotted over the last couple of weeks. So the real question isn't, have we gone out, have we put it into law, have we made a statement somewhere that we're going to become net zero, but are we seeing that translating into actual action? Things like phasing out coal-fired power stations, things like internal combustion engine cars being replaced by electric cars, things like introducing carbon pricing, which will have an impact or create a financial penalty for reducing emissions. So what this chart shows is the number of policies around the world focused on climate change over the last 10 years, 20 years, that clearly has picked up quite significantly in the last few years. There's an awful lot further to go. We don't yet have the policies that are anywhere near enough to get us to the targets that we've set, but we are starting to get there. And I think that for us is one of the reasons why when we think about climate change, when we have conversations with clients, which we do, who aren't particularly interested in climate change, this isn't a climate change question in isolation. This is ultimately about understanding that there is a change happening in the real world that will impact companies, irrespective of whether they believe it or not, irrespective of whether they're right or not. Fundamentally, there is momentum that is gathering pace, that is starting to have an impact on companies, on economies, and is starting to have an impact on investments. And this isn't an academic question. And that impact will be disruptive. We shouldn't pretend this is going to be a smooth journey. It's not. What this chart shows is the last, quite a lot, I think I put quite a lot, 1800 on the left-hand side. So several centuries of the sort of shape of the global energy mix, with the sort of lightish blue line at the top being coal, which got quite big for a while, and you got oil obviously in the darker green. But basically the large majority of today's energy mix being fossil fuels. Fossil fuels represent about 3/4 of the world's carbon emissions. Tackling climate change essentially means phasing down fossil fuels. There's no real other way of saying it than that, but ultimately fossil fuels are going to have to drop very dramatically within the world's energy mix. And we need to change that quite dramatically over a relatively short space of time. So the sort of bar on the right-hand side that sort of stuck out is what that needs to become by 2050 to put us in line with not even the most ambitious Paris goals, but sort of modest Paris goals. So we need to fundamentally change things in a relatively short period of time in order to reach the commitments that have been made. And that's going to create disruption. That disruption comes on top of a world that is already becoming increasingly fluid. So the chart on the right is a sort of reference point, shows you the average lifetime of companies in the S&P 500. So sort of roughly how long do companies remain leaders within their industries, which goes up and down, but is generally going down over time. So there is a disruption here. This is going to be difficult for companies that have built up successful business models based on what worked for the last 20 years. But the reality is that we're at a moment where the things that will work in the next 20 years, the things that will lead to success in the future, are not the things that have made companies successful in the past. Some of them are consistent, but we're at a point of change, certainly in our view, where a lot of the things that companies will need to deal with in the future will be very different. And driving through the rear view mirror, which is effectively when things are the same, when things stay the same, you can drive reasonably safely when the road is straight through the rear view mirror. When you start to see things bend, whether that's around climate change, whether that's around nature loss, whether that's around social unrest in different parts of the world, inequality, when the road starts to bend and you're driving through the rear view mirror, you crash quite quickly. And I think certainly we are at a point where there is a bend coming up. We're starting to bend already, and that there is a real challenge, certainly for companies that don't think about what that bend looks like and when it's coming, but also for our industry as investors in those companies and in those assets that miss that point. I won't spend too long dwelling on this other than to say this again. This is to translate this point. This is not just about theoretical high-level aspirations to become net zero. There are policies, and those policies are having an impact. There are lawsuits for not following the policies that companies have set out or not meeting the laws that governments have laid out. And they are similarly starting to grow. And I can't decide my view on this one, but you're starting to see hedge funds now creating war chests, effectively, to fund climate litigation against companies, which feels like the wrong way of doing this, but I think is indicative of the threat that failure to meet commitments is starting to pose. To come back a little bit to the advertising. So it's not really advertising. So Schroders, we're a fairly large asset manager. We have made a number of commitments around climate change. So the one on the left, which we were a founding member of something called the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative, which is kind of pretty much in a similar category to the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Yep. Under GFANZ, which again is a similar kind of exercise. It's about we've committed through that exercise that we will transition our business and the funds that we manage to net zero by 2050. Bluntly, this is not going to be a straightforward exercise. Right now, we could not build a portfolio that comprises only companies or only assets that are already net zero in a credible way. So this is going to require a transition in the real world. We want to be part of that transition, and we're active players in that rather than simply observers. We've also done something called science-based targets. So this is kind of probably the main body in the world that does validation of climate targets. And we were the largest asset manager initially to have had our targets validated by the SBTi. Basically, it does the same thing. It commits us to laying out a plan of how we're going to decarbonise our business over the next 30 years or so. And the point behind all of this is that ultimately, this is not it's not a marketing exercise. This becomes and has spurred, certainly within our company, but I think we're not unrepresentative of a large part of the industry as well, a huge focus on how are we going to achieve this and how do we play an active role in achieving that transition, rather than simply thinking about this as an exercise in aspirations or trying to say the right things. It's also not a question that is isolated from investment returns. What this chart shows, and this is our analysis, is sort of global equity markets. So the MSCI ACWI is a sort of measure of global equity markets. And if you look at the risk to the value of those companies, somewhere between 10 and 20%, I don't like to be too precise in these things, is at risk as a result of climate change. You've got about 30-40% of companies whose risk is complete. So 100% of their business is at risk as a result of the transition to a low carbon world based on what they're doing today and how they're doing it. And then a number of companies that also benefit from that transition. So this becomes an average, but this isn't a hypothetical question. This is a real risk that we're already starting to see play out. I will probably skip through this one because I think that this is a fairly critical point. We've sort of talked a little bit inside out, outside in, which is a really important way of distinguishing things. But I think it's also really important that we think about how do we find the ways of reaching net zero that are going to create value for everybody involved rather than simply being constraints. There's this tendency to think, well, this is just going to create a constraint. It's going to kind of gridlock us into something that we would have done something different, but it's going to kind of tie us into making choices that we don't really want to make. And I think that tends to be something of a tendency with this area. Our experience has been that where we can find companies and assets that are themselves transitioning, it's incredibly rewarding. If we can be part of the journey to companies that are themselves reducing their emissions, if we can own them, if we can support them on that journey, if we can engage with them and encourage them to take that journey, it can be an extremely rewarding process. So what the chart on the right-hand bar says, or the right-hand chart says, is in very simple terms, companies that have seen their emissions going up over the last 5 years have, the left-hand side is companies that have cut their emissions most over the last 5 years have generally speaking outperformed. Companies that means they've done better, their financial performance has been better than the stock market. Companies that have done the worst, have seen their emissions increasing by the most, have generally speaking performed most badly relative to the stock market. So you would have done, if you had bought the ones that did best and sold the ones that did worst, you would have outperformed the stock market by about 4% a year, which puts you into the bracket of pretty much top performing hedge funds. Again, there's a step in there of can you identify those companies at the beginning? We think we can at least partially successfully identify which companies they are. More importantly, we can be part of that process through engagement. So I think the point that I really want to sort of try and hammer home is that our role is not to be passive observers. Our role is not to just think about which companies are going to get better placed or worse placed. We are all active participants in that process. Our role as asset managers isn't just simply to try and figure out which companies look good today versus don't look good today. It's to be a part of that process of encouraging companies to cut their emissions. If we can get that right, we can reduce emissions in the real world. We can allow investors in those companies to benefit from the value that gets created. And ultimately, this becomes a win-win for everybody. And so, I mean, again, a good example that's topical in my mind is around the banking industry, where the conversations that we have with banks that we invest in, again, become incredibly powerful, where you've got a number of different organizations sharing thoughts on the right way to get to a destination. And it's not the destination itself that's the sole question. I mean, that's a hard enough question itself, but the journey and how are you going to get there is the real question. And I think we're all figuring out some of the details. We're all trying to figure out how to do this in the most effective way. But I do think we are at least asking the right questions. And if we can get those questions more and more right, everybody should benefit. I think I've run out of time, at least run out of time. So I will pause there.
Thank you, Andrew. No. Thank you very much, Andrew. I am actually going to stand because my pink socks is overwhelming. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for your input and for the lessons shared. Me personally, my key takeaway is the lack of education. I think we need to really focus on educating ourselves around what is out there when it comes to sustainable investment and where should our money be going, and we should actually look into how we can actually play our role in the financial world. Sarah Kay, I'm going to start with you. What role do you think banks play in educating their stakeholders, including their shareholders and their account holders, in the importance and the implications of that shift towards a net zero agenda?
Well, I think what we're seeing is those stakeholders, the investors, the shareholders, are really growing in sophistication. You know, a lot of the investors are part of Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, or other kind of professional societies which themselves are coming up with frameworks by which they can use to evaluate the banks and how well the banks are doing. So I think there's a real kind of two-way conversation there with those stakeholders that's really growing. I think now, nobody in a bank really expects to have an investor meeting without climate being one of the key topics of conversation. So I think there's education going on in both directions. When it comes to the clients and account holders, I think there's a huge amount that banks can do. So banks really want to see the client's transition plans, because ultimately the bank's transition plan is just a roll-up of all of their clients' transition plans ultimately. So there's a lot of conversations going on about that, what their CapEx requirements are, getting numbers around this, getting numbers around the emissions and things. So, and I know that, what the banks are really appreciating is that there's a real need for kind of systemic change. So it's not just about looking at one pointed activity. They're really wanting to think about things in the round. So just a couple of examples I want to give. So one is NatWest, who's got a, and I don't want to get this wrong, so it's called a Clean Transport Specialist Accelerator. So they provide coaching to their clients, thought leadership, community, access to networks, and support from a manufacturing catapult. And another example is JP Morgan, where they have a centre for carbon transition. They're helping their clients get the data, do the carbon footprinting, thinking about the expertise firm-wide that they need. So they're really giving them research and advice and helping them with their business strategies and helping them with their disclosures. So, and they're thinking really across value chains as well. So I think, there are real signs of kind of innovation in the way that banks are approaching this with their clients and customers.
But I wonder if they're using the data then from the clients towards their scope 3 emissions though. So I wonder if it's also a win-win for both of them, from an educational point of view, but also from the banking reporting point of view as well.
Well, definitely. I think, many of our banks at the moment are having to do their carbon accounting based on emission factors, which are kind of like sector-wide numbers. And it's very difficult for them to show the progress that they're making in the levers that they're pulling, because that's not necessarily going to show up in these impact factors. So there's this concept of a data quality ladder, and although most banks are starting off at the lowest, the lowest rung of that ladder, there is an expectation that in the coming years we're going to see a real quick upping of the quality of the data that they're using to get to actual real data, real emission data, not kind of things that they're assumptions and proxy data that they're going to have to use. And that's happening because we're seeing things like the ISSB bring consolidating different reporting standards. And also we'll end up hopefully with much better kind of electronic tagging of emissions data, so that it can all be much more automated in the way that this emissions data is pulled through ultimately. But there's a real long journey to go, and many of our banks, particularly in less developed countries, are really, really struggling with this, because they don't even have the impact factors.
Exactly.
So there's definitely a massive win to be had in improving the data environment.
And thank you, Sarah. And speaking about impact factors, Sarah T, what sectors are particularly ripe for investment and impact investment opportunities at the moment?
Well, that's a great question. And I feel like following after Andy's amazing presentation,
it was good, actually,
what sector isn't ripe for intentional finance that wants to contribute solutions? So, I mean, there are two zones where we see some really exciting activity. One is around just transition finance. So this is the idea in the race to net zero. How do we ensure that future system is fair and socially inclusive? And if you look at things like Uxbridge, you can see that unless we think about the political economy of the transition, if people don't vote for it, all of that policy flourishing that's so exciting and moving in the right direction and still way, way, way too slow is going to start stalling and regressing. So we think that there are some really exciting innovations around just transition. One fund that recently got mounted out of Generation, the Just Climate Fund, they just raised 1.5 billion private capital strategies to try and transition hard to abate sectors. So I think that there are obviously prime opportunities on climate specifically, but actually, and I love both your presentations, but actually, Andy, your distillation of what investment is, taking savings and putting it to solve real economy problems. I'm going to put that in my top pocket, because that's exactly what the framing of impact, except those real, I guess those problems are very specifically social and environmental problems. So we see promising innovation on the deep impact side, on asset-backed models, so affordable housing, housing-based models for issues like domestic violence, so in the kind of deep impact space. But more broadly, in any asset strategy, there will be a promising impact investing opportunity that can be explored, because the social issues are real, the environmental issues are real. So let's take some of those savings and invest them to deliver for a problem. So, but certainly, transition financing is a huge opportunity, obviously.
Thanks, Sarah. Andy, other than, of course, your marketing team are going to love you because of the slides. I have a question for you. So when Schroders decided to become more sustainable and look into their ESG agenda and zero agenda, how did that, have you been able to measure the impact when it comes to profitability because of that transition? And how did your clients react to that?
So it's an interesting question. I always think this is a little bit like asking a consumer company, what benefit did marketing have? Now, I know there's lots of ways that you can in principle measure marketing, but more fundamentally, you kind of know that if you don't do it, you're going to get into trouble. You don't exactly know quite where and how and whether the last dollar in this advertising campaign achieved something or didn't achieve something, but you kind of have to, for want of a better word, have a conviction that this is the right way to run the business without trying to, certainly in our experience, we haven't really been able to distill it down and say this bit of profit came from something or something else. What we do know is that our clients are increasingly asking us the question, not only what returns did you generate for me in these funds, but how did you generate those returns? What was the process that you went through? And they are increasingly asking questions that are, frankly, becoming more demanding and becoming more specific in terms of questions. So we do know that, for example, 7 years ago we had two sustainable funds, sustainable rather than impact, but sustainable funds that we had within the firm. They were about $1 billion or so. We've now got about $50 billion that are managed in sustainable funds.
Okay.
We know that our clients continue to ask us for different kinds of funds, and we know that those funds grow more quickly in terms of clients investing in them than we see from other funds, or the firm more broadly. So we know that there is a growing set of questions. I also know, if I'm being honest, that our clients are themselves on a journey. They are themselves working out, actually there's different flavours here of sustainability, there are different, even climate change sounds sort of fairly simple, but there's about at least 4 or 5 different ways that you can invest in transition. There's low carbon companies, there's climate solutions, there's just economy focused types of endeavours. There's different ways of approaching the same question. I think for us it's going to be increasingly about recognising that there are different solutions fit different people. The right solution will vary depending on what anyone is individually trying to achieve and what they want to see their fund invested in, rather than maybe where we were 5 years ago, which was there was climate funds and there was other funds, or there was sustainable funds and other funds, and they were all a bit of a mishmash of stuff that was sort of jumbled together.
And do you see COVID impacting that? Because it did give us an opportunity to reflect back on our personal purpose as individuals, as investors. Do you see any increase post-COVID, or COVID has not impacted you at all?
It didn't really. So COVID didn't really make too much difference. And actually, our thought was it might go the other way. So if I go back to the financial crisis back in 2007, 2008, 2009, that there was a hit to sustainable investment at that time. People became much more focused on sort of basically battening down the hatches.
Okay.
And there was certainly a sense, well, hang on, we're going into sort of slight panic mode, everyone's sort of batten down the hatches mode. But the reality is sustainability in general and climate change within that weren't really impacted. We continue to see the same growth, the same demand, the same trends that we'd seen previously. What I will say is that the war in Ukraine and some of the, particularly the last 12 or 18 months or so in terms of political statements, I think in some parts of the world, not so much here, but in some parts of the world have certainly created a bit more of a mixed picture. I think, you know, and I'm basically talking about the US, where you do now have a much more polarised view of climate change and sustainability.
Excellent, thank you. Before I keep on asking, does anyone have any questions you would like? Oh, well done, we do. We've got 4 questions. Gosh, you should have spoken earlier. Okay, we will start with the lady over there. Actually, I'm going to stand because I need to see people. Okay,
I'm not standing there.
No, you don't stand. I need to see you.
I want to show myself. My name is Kerry and I work in the Nature and Climate Resilience team at UKGBC.
Very cool.
Great presentations. I just had a question more geared towards nature than carbon, but it's inherently interlinked. There are a number of private funds available that are bid towards climate in general and nature underneath that you've alluded to. Another one also including Aviva. And we've got a lot of nature goals in the UK, Nature 30 by 30, and we sit in a current situation where we're one of the least biodiverse countries in Europe. Yet, we have this massive nature funding gap that is frequently cited by the Finance Earth and Environment Bank. We've done a bit of work in this space, but what we've found is that there is a gap between the money itself and then those that actually can do that action on the ground. We were curious, well, I'm curious, how best do you think we can increase that flow of money, get the communication going, and what types of financial mechanisms might actually be best in this situation? Is it blended finance? Is it, I will stop jargoning, but...
I can take that, Gihan.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So we've done lots of work on something called place-based impact investing. More jargon. But
can you de-jargon it for us?
I'll try and de-jargon it.
Okay, please,
but
yes.
One of the principles behind it was trying to flow capital to underserved places within the UK and flow institutional capital. So how do you get the local government pension scheme to invest in real economy opportunities, including natural capital, in places like Wakefield or Hull or rural areas or outside basically London, Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham? How do you get money moving? And it is a combination of everything you shared. So I think on natural capital specifically, actually Schroders have good, I'll let Andy come back on that, but I bet UNIP have got a ton of information, but certainly we found a mixture of, so we've been working to try and solve the problems that are getting between local government who want to allocate and opportunities that say that they can't be found. So there are origination issues, there are financing vehicle issues, there's broad awareness issues. So I think it's over the past 2 years, we've just been working on coalition building, building community, bringing UK government together with local authorities together with communities together with a mixed group of investors. So sitting a LGPS next to a mainstream asset manager, next to a foundation, next to a social investor, and doing some of the kind of knotty market building work that ultimately, once there have been a few proof of concepts, the money will start flowing and the market will start building. But there's no substitute, I think, for non-profit actors, market builders who see an amazing opportunity like that and say, why people want it but it's not happening? If that's the sentence you're saying, you need a market builder. And people like the Green Finance Institute, I bet UNIP would be very helpful. And the Green Building Council itself, I'm sure, doing dazzling work. So,
Sarah, would you like to add more?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's huge scope for for innovation in this space, I think through innovative structures and blending of finance from different parties that are going to take different elements of risk. But I think that there's one key element is that for many of the more ecological, and speaking as somebody that started out my career in ecological management, practical management, often the times there isn't really an income stream from the project that you want to implement. One key way that you can generate an income stream is through voluntary carbon markets. And I think there's, there are some barriers to that. So I think that the markets really need to develop and the standards really need to evolve and become a lot more robust, because at the moment, there's huge confusion as to, is somebody buying a carbon removal or an avoided emission? Is it really additional? So this concept of additionality, of permanence, there's real issues, and also one of the barriers is kind of the ticket size. So many of these projects are very small, whereas institutional investors look at much bigger sizes of investments and don't have the resources to look at very small ticket sizes. So I think there's a huge amount of scope through working together in multi-stakeholder initiatives to overcome those barriers and make sure that what happens in a really, really robust way. Because I think there is a massive risk that a lot of people think, carbon credits, plant trees, you don't want the wrong trees on the wrong soil in the wrong place. And only ecologists really understand actually whether the desired outcomes are going to be achieved or not. So you've got to kind of build that bridge.
Thank you, Sarah. Second question, can we have the lady at the back, please? Thank you. And then the lady here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Shakira. I'm currently a student, but previously I was in impact investment in Malaysia. So I have a question for Sarah.
Love it.
Sarah T, yes.
So how do you measure impact? Because in sustainable investment, it's just do no harm, right? But in impact, it's actually creating good. And we kind of struggle with what we define as impact. What is the time scale of that impact? Because most impact is like 5 years, right? You kind of, and if it's a new industry, kind of how do you measure that impact? It's a whole thing. And it's difficult, and there's no global standard for that. So that's my question to Sarah T. And another question to Sarah K and Andrew. Nuclear, is it part of your climate mitigation solutions? Yeah.
Thank you.
So, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a whole thing. So measuring impact, I mean, even if you don't want to do harm, you need to understand how do you embody harm in order to check that you've not created it. So actually for ESG investing and impact investing, some of the core measurement problems are the same. So it's very easy now. So for example, there are industry standards around measurement approaches. So there's something called the Impact Management Project, which set a kind of a collective industry norms about how we approach measurement, and it's really about how do you frame an impact investing strategy and then go after it. There are also kind of core publicly available sets of metrics. So there's something called the IRIS Plus catalogue, which is like the international standard of metrics. But there's many a slip twixt cup and lip, right? You've got your metrics, you've got your strategy, but the real hard work of chasing down women lifted out of poverty and being able to bring it back to the invested entity and then make a change to your strategy. The whole idea is you're not collecting it because it's lovely to collect. You're collecting it because you really care if women were lifted out of poverty. So you need to know if they weren't so that you can change stuff so that you can optimize for women being left out of poverty. So what I've given you there is a cheeky non-answer, which is to say this is a work in progress for the whole field. You're absolutely right to ask the question. It's the question that every impact investor asks. If someone tells you they've got it sewn up,
they haven't.
They're lying. But you get a lot of points for best efforts, doing the hard work of creating these circles of accountability, and ultimately over time getting better and better and better.
Thank you, Sarah. And regarding the second questions.
Nuclear.
Yes.
I can say that in the Net Zero Banking Alliance framework, we do not opine on nuclear. We require our members to set a decarbonisation target in line with 1.5 for power generation. It's, you know, it's up to them how they achieve that. So we're not prescriptive. We don't, you know, obviously there's been a massive debate in the EU taxonomy on this point. We don't kind of prescribe the use of any one particular taxonomy because we are a global initiative. And I think if you look at the energy transition in different countries, invariably it's a very different story in different jurisdictions. So that's something on which we don't opine. But I'll hand to you because you probably do.
Fine on nuclear. I think you break it down into two questions. Can nuclear be a part of a climate solution transition pathway? Yeah, it's the low carbon source of power. From a climate point of view, it is a way of decarbonising power generation. Will it, and does it make sense for it to be so? I think there's a few things that are challenges. One, timeframes to build new nuclear capacity are pretty long. So we can't wait. So it's not an either-or situation. So that's the challenge. Secondly, the economics are not what they were relative to renewable sources of power. So there are challenges there, but ultimately it's going to come down, and there are social concerns around safety, which are fairly obvious. But ultimately it's going to come down to governments making decisions about whether they want to see nuclear being developed as to whether or not it becomes part of it. It is a low carbon, unavoidably is a low carbon source of power. The question is, I don't think is nuclear going to replace renewables or wind farms? It's going to have to be at least both in terms of how we reach the transition. This is not a case, if we're going to get anywhere close to net zero over the next 3 decades, it's pretty much pull every lever that's available. It's not a question of which lever to pull. It's the same, just going to one stat to throw in on the nature point. If you look at climate reduction, to meet the goals of Paris, so to get somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees long-run temperature rise, nature-based solutions, carbon sequestration could be about 30% of the solution. So about 2% of climate finance is going into that area. So again, that's another area where there should be more growth. It's not there at the moment. Number of impediments that we've talked about to that, but it's about pulling all of those levers, not which lever to pull.
Thank you. Here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your insights. Sarah T, I think it's your lucky day today.
Oh, yay.
I've spent 2 decades in the fashion industry, and my company scales next-gen materials made out of agricultural waste for the fashion industry.
Amazing.
Well done.
Amazing. Okay, great.
Well, it will be amazing when we get lots of money to pay to scale our company. Which is where my question lands, which is that so we're raising at the moment, and we're running into the same challenges that lots of businesses like us with tangible solutions are running into, particularly within the VC space. Interesting, are you 10x? And we'd really like to support software. As we see the sort of transition moving forward and the landscape changing, and we gradually realise, and hopefully investors gradually realise, that as much as it's great and necessary and fantastic having software that can tell you how shit our impact is, we sort of already know that, and then at the end of it you're like, well, so let's make some new materials to solve that. Do you see the VC space and the impact VC space changing, and how quickly, around their recognition of this? Because my sense is that investment's got to happen differently, and people are calling themselves impact investors, and yet they're not prepared to actually move into this tangible space. What do you see the future landscape of that looking like?
Well, that is such a great question, particularly because I was recently the BVCA Excellence and Impact Award judge.
Oh, well.
So I can tell you, I was really staggered by the quality of applications and the depth and breadth of applications coming through from emerging impact VC managers. So the winner of, and I don't know if you've approached them, but the winner of the Excellence and Impact Award was Circularity Capital, who invest in circular economy business models. And I think other managers like them are emerging that have a very robust impact thesis, who see as someone said to me, there's no business that's going to IPO in 5 years that doesn't have a strong sustainability thesis underpinning it. So I think the greatest growth, the most rapid growth in terms of a changing industry and kind of impact interest, I'd say, is in the PE VC area.
Agree.
So we can chat and I can tell you the 10 names of people you should talk to.
Thank you so much.
We work a lot with VCs, and at the moment we're trying to convince them to look into sustainability for their portfolio. So we're working with the largest 3 in London to create a checklist for their portfolio of companies that they can follow in order to start their sustainability journey. And you can't IPO if you don't become sustainable. Either way, it's because of the London Stock Exchange asking you for the regulations. But from my perspective, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of the VCs are looking into the tech as opposed to sustainability. But I haven't seen the shift that Sarah has, so I'll be interested to see who you're speaking to, so we can bring them on board as best practices. So with the VCs we're trying to work with and change their mind. Okay. We're out of time. So sorry. Can we have just one? We only have one more. Oh gosh, never mind. We'll take it later. How about that? You can have it. You can ask the panelists after this. How about that? Happy? Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming.